Chapter 1. The world that Issei Hyoudou woke into was not the one he remembered falling asleep in. He knew this the moment he opened his eyes and found the ceiling of his room replaced by a canopy of dark stone, veined with faint red light that pulsed like something breathing. He sat up too fast, his head spinning, and his hand instinctively went to his chest where the boosted gear usually rested dormant beneath his skin. It was still there. He could feel it, quiet and warm, the way it always was when Drake slept. But everything else was wrong. The room was carved from obsidian, polished so smooth it reflected his own face back at him, pale and confused. A single window, narrow and arched, looked out over a landscape that did not belong to Kuoh, or to Japan, or to anything he had ever seen. Towers rose in the distance like black needles, and above them the sky itself was the color of a bruise, purple fading into a deep, starless red at the horizon. There was no sun. There were 3 moons. Okay, Issei said out loud, mostly to hear his own voice and confirm he still had one. Okay, this is fine. This is completely fine. It was not fine. He swung his legs off the bed, noticing distantly that the bed itself was enormous, large enough for 4 people, draped in fabric so fine it felt like water against his skin. Someone had dressed him in unfamiliar clothes while he slept, dark and formal, cut in a style that reminded him vaguely of old European nobility crossed with something more severe, more militant. There was a crest stitched into the collar. He didn't recognize it. A voice rumbled up from within his own body, low and ancient, tinged with the particular irritation of a dragon who did not enjoy being woken. Partner, before you spiral into another one of your predictable panics, you should know that we are no longer in the world we were in. Yeah, Drake, I kind of got that part myself, Issei muttered, pressing his palms against his eyes. Any chance you know where we are instead? None. I have been asleep as long as you have. But I can tell you this much. The dragon's voice sharpened, taking on the weight it only used when something mattered. The magic in this place is old. Older than anything I sensed in our world. And it is saturated with something I have not felt in millennia. Which is? Devil magic. An enormous quantity of it. And yet it is weak, Issei blinked. Weak how? Weak as in thin. Diluted. As though an ocean's worth of devil magic has been poured out across a puddle's worth of strength. I do not understand it yet. But I would wager the answer to where we are is tied to the answer to what happened to the devils here. Before Issei could ask anything else, the door to the chamber opened without a knock, and a woman stepped inside, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who owned the room she was walking into. She was tall, dressed in dark violet robes trimmed in silver, with hair the color of midnight pulled back in a severe braid, and eyes that studied him the way a scholar studies a difficult text. Bat-like wings, small and folded neatly against her back, marked her unmistakably as a devil. But something about the set of her shoulders, the wariness in her posture, made Issei's instincts prickle. You're awake, she said. Her voice was crisp, formal, carrying the faint echo of authority long practiced. Good. That saves us the trouble of explaining twice. Explaining what, exactly? Issei asked, standing slowly, keeping his hands loose at his sides out of habit. Where I am. Who you are. Why I woke up in a room that looks like it belongs in a horror movie. A corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. All 3 in time. My name is Seraphal, no? Forgive me. Old habits. She paused, something flickering behind her eyes, quickly smoothed away. My name is Celine Voss. I am the acting steward of the Obsidian Court, one of the last 12 devil enclaves remaining on this world. One of the last 12, Issei repeated slowly. That doesn't sound like a lot. It isn't. Celine's expression didn't change, but something in her voice tightened. There were once dozens of devil territories spanning 3 continents. Great houses with power to rival kings. Now there are 12 enclaves, each hiding behind wards and treaties and the goodwill of races that would rather see us extinct. Issei felt Drake stir within him, listening closely now. I don't understand, Issei said. Devils are strong. I've known devils my whole life. Some of the strongest people I've ever met were devils. Celine's eyes narrowed, sharp with sudden interest. You speak as though devils are respected where you come from. They're one of the major powers. Devils, angels, fallen angels, they're all sort of balanced against each other. There are devil kings. Some of them are terrifying. Issei thought of Surzex, of the crimson light of his power, of Rias's brother casually erasing threats that would have flattened cities. Where I'm from, devils are anything but weak. For a long moment, Celine said nothing. Then she let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a very long time. Then you truly are not from this world, she said quietly. Come. There is someone who needs to hear this. And you need to understand exactly what you have fallen into, before it decides for you what you are going to be. She turned and walked out without waiting to see if he'd follow. Issei glanced down at himself, at the strange clothes, then out the narrow window at the 3 moons hanging in a poisoned sky, and decided that following was probably the smartest available option. Drake, he murmured under his breath as he walked, please tell me you have a plan. My plan, the dragon said dryly, is to listen. You would be wise to do the same for once, before your mouth gets ahead of your sense. Rude. Accurate. The corridors of the obsidian court were quiet in a way that unsettled Issei more than any noise could have. Kuoh Academy, the occult research club, Rias's territory, all of it had a certain hum of life to it even in its stillest moments, the sense of activity happening somewhere nearby. Here, the silence had weight. Torches burned along the walls with pale blue flame that gave no warmth, and the few devils he passed in the halls moved with their heads down, wings tucked tight, eyes flicking to him and away again with something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Why are they looking at me like that? Issei asked quietly. Because you fell out of the sky in a column of light bright enough to be seen from 3 enclaves over, Celine said without turning around. And because whatever brought you here shattered 4 of our strongest containment wards in the process. People are afraid of what that might mean. Whether you are a weapon someone sent against us, or something worse. I'm not a weapon, Issei said immediately. I mean I have one. Sort of. But I'm not. We will discuss what you are and are not once you understand what you have arrived in the middle of, Celine said, and something in her tone closed the subject. They descended a wide staircase into a hall that opened into what could only be described as a war room, though it looked more like the last gathering point of a losing side than the command center of any real power. Maps were spread across a long stone table, marked with symbols Issei didn't recognize, red ink bleeding across territories that had clearly once been larger. A handful of devils stood around it, all bearing the same tired, wary alertness Celine carried. At the head of the table stood an old man, wings folded, silver hair pulled back, a long scar running from his temple to his jaw. His eyes, when they landed on Issei, were sharp enough to cut. So this is the boy who broke our wards falling out of nowhere, the old man said. His voice was gravel and iron. Lucian Ashgrave. I lead what remains of the Obsidian Court's defense. Celine tells me you claim to be from a world where devils are not hunted like game. I don't claim it, Issei said, meeting the old man's stare without flinching, because backing down from intimidating older men who radiated dangerous authority was, unfortunately, a skill he'd had a lot of practice with. It's just true. Where I'm from, devils are one of the top 3 powers in existence. Nobody hunts them. If anything, people are scared of them. A ripple went through the room. Not disbelief, Issei realized. Something closer to grief. Must be a nice world, muttered a younger devil near the back, arms crossed, bitterness sharp in his voice. Cade, Lucian said, a warning in the single syllable, and the younger devil fell silent, though his jaw stayed tight. Someone want to explain to me what's actually going on here? Issei asked. Because I've been awake for maybe 10 minutes and all I've gotten so far is that devils are the weakest race and everyone's terrified of me. I'd like a little more than that before I decide what to do about it. Lucian studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward the map. Come here then. I will give you the short version, because the long version is a history soaked in enough blood to fill an ocean, and we do not have time to drown you in it before deciding what use you might be. Issei approached the table, and Celine fell in beside him, close enough that he understood she was there to watch him as much as to assist him. Long ago, Lucian began, devils on this world were exactly what you describe. A great power. Perhaps the great power. We warred with the angels and the fallen in a conflict so vast it reshaped continents. And we won. Not evenly, not without cost, but we won, and in victory, we grew arrogant. That tracks, Drake murmured privately, only for Issei to hear. Pride is the oldest trap there is. There was a ritual, Lucian continued, performed by the highest members of the 72 pillars, a working meant to bind the power of angels and fallen both into the bloodline of devils forever, to ensure our supremacy could never again be challenged. It was meant to be the final victory. Instead, it shattered something fundamental in the magic that gives devils our strength. The ritual failed catastrophically, and the backlash did not just fail to steal power from our enemies. It stripped power from us. All of us. Every devil born after that day, and eventually every devil who lived through it, inherited a fraction, a shadow, of what our race once commanded. How long ago was this? Issei asked. 300 years, Celine said quietly. Long enough that no living devil remembers what we once were except through old texts and older grief. Long enough for every other race on this world to remember exactly what we did to them during the war, and to realize that the ones who beat them into submission can no longer defend themselves. So everyone came for revenge, Issei said slowly, understanding settling over him like a weight. Everyone came for revenge, Lucian confirmed. Angels. Fallen. Yukai. The dragon clans. Even the humans who once feared us learned to hunt us instead. 300 years of attrition. What was once an empire spanning 3 continents is now 12 enclaves clinging to the margins of the world, hiding behind wards that grow weaker every year, negotiating survival one desperate treaty at a time. His scarred jaw tightened. We are not a power anymore, boy. We are prey. And prey that remembers what it was like to be a predator makes for a particularly bitter kind of survivor. The room was silent. Issei looked around at the tired, wary faces, at the maps marked with territory after territory bleeding away in red ink, and felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest. He thought of Rias, fierce and proud, commanding her peerage with easy confidence. He thought of Surzex, casually powerful enough to end wars by simply existing. He tried to imagine that world with all its strength scraped away, its people hunted through the margins of existence, and found the image sat wrong in his stomach, heavy and sour. Why are you telling me all this? He asked finally. You don't know me. For all you know, I could be exactly the kind of threat you're worried about. Because, Lucian said, you fell out of a sky that does not belong to this world, wearing a sacred gear that even I, in all my years, have never sensed the like of, and because whatever power tore its way into our territory when you arrived was strong enough that for one moment, every hunting party currently converging on our enclave hesitated. He leaned forward, hands pressed flat on the table. We do not have the luxury of pretending that did not happen. If you are what I suspect you might be, boy, then you are the first thing to fall into devil hands in 300 years capable of frightening our enemies. And frightened enemies are the only kind of mercy this world still has to offer us. Issei felt Drake go very still inside him, the dragon's ancient attention sharpening to a point. Partner, Drake said quietly, and there was something in his voice Issei rarely heard from him. Something close to resolve. I believe I understand now why we were brought here. And I believe you already know what you are going to say to this old man's unspoken question. Issei did know. He'd known since the moment Lucian described devils being hunted through the margins of their own world, since the word prey had settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. He thought of every devil he'd ever called a friend, every one he'd fought beside, every one whose strength and pride and life he had taken for granted as simply how the world worked. This world had taken all of that away and left grief and red ink on a map instead. What do you need from me? Issei asked, and how fast can I start? Something shifted in Lucian's expression, not quite hope, because Issei suspected these people had learned not to trust hope a long time ago, but something adjacent to it. Celine's eyes, when he glanced at her, had lost some of their wariness. That, Lucian said, is the right question. But before I answer it, you should know the cost of asking it. Every enclave that has tried to resist openly in the last 300 years has been erased for the effort. The hunters do not simply want territory. They want to be certain devils never rise again. If you stand with us, boy, you will not be fighting a war. You will be painting a target on yourself large enough to draw every predator on this world down on your head at once. Issei thought about that for exactly as long as it took to remember every devil he'd ever cared about, and found the decision had already been made somewhere underneath conscious thought. Good, he said. Let them come. Lucien studied him for a long moment, and then, for the first time since Issei had entered the room, the old devil almost smiled. Then we have a great deal of work to do, he said, and very little time to do it in. Celine. Show him the wards. Show him the maps. Show him everything. If this boy is going to become what I think this enclave needs him to become, he needs to understand exactly what he is agreeing to defend, down to the last stone and the last name. Yes, steward, Celine said, and for the first time, there was something almost warm in the way she looked at Issei. Come with me. I will show you what is left of us. And then, guardian, you can decide if you still mean what you said. I do, Issei said, and meant it more than he had meant almost anything in his life. Lead the way. As they left the war room, Drake's voice rumbled low and thoughtful within him. You realize, partner, that this world does not know what you are capable of yet. Neither, frankly, do you? We have grown complacent, the two of us, coasting on strength earned in a different world entirely. So what, you're saying we need to get stronger? I am saying, Drake said, and Issei could hear something that might have been anticipation coloring the ancient dragon's voice, that a world which has forgotten what devils can become is about to receive a very rude reminder. And I, for one, intend to enjoy watching them learn. Issei allowed himself a small, grim smile as he followed Celine deeper into the heart of the last standing devils of a broken world. Yeah, he said quietly. Me too. Chapter 2. The Obsidian Court, Issei learned as Celine led him through its winding halls, was not a single fortress but a warren of them, built downward into the bones of a dead volcano and outward into a labyrinth of caverns that had once, centuries ago, housed the proud and populous Devil City. Now most of those caverns stood empty, their halls hollow, their fine architecture cracked and cobwebbed, home to nothing but echoes and the occasional watchpost. There were once 40,000 devils living within these walls, Celine said, her voice carefully flat as they passed through an abandoned market district, stalls long since collapsed, banners rotted to threads. Now there are less than 3,000. Most of the enclave lives clustered near the central wards, where the protection is strongest. The rest of this place is maintained only enough to keep it from collapsing on our heads. 3,000, Issei repeated. He tried to picture Kuoh's devil population by comparison and felt a chill settle over him. Rias's peerage alone, small as it was, would have represented meaningful strength here. An entire Devil King's territory, with its countless servants and vassals and standing armies, was simply inconceivable. It is the largest enclave remaining, Celine said. Which should tell you something about the size of the others. They emerged onto a wide balcony carved into the cavern wall, overlooking what had once clearly been a grand plaza, and Celine gestured out at the wards. Issei could see them now that he knew to look, a faint shimmer in the air like heat haze, ringing the inhabited heart of the enclave in overlapping layers. Every layer you see took decades to weave and costs enormous resources to maintain, Celine said. Each layer is weaker than devil wards were 300 years ago, because we no longer have the raw magical strength to weave them as our ancestors did. We compensate with quantity. Layer upon layer, redundancy upon redundancy, so that if the hunters break through one, 3 more remain. And if they break through all of them? Celine's expression didn't change, but her voice went quieter. Then the enclave falls, and everyone inside it dies or is scattered, and we start again somewhere else, smaller than before. It has happened 6 times in 300 years. 6 enclaves gone? We are running out of somewhere else. Issei stared out at the shimmering wards, at the empty ruins beyond them, and felt Drake's presence pulse quietly within his chest, listening, cataloging, weighing. Who are the hunters? Issei asked. You keep saying the word like it means something specific. It does. Celine turned to face him fully now, arms crossed, wings settling. After the ritual failed, every race that devils had once subjugated or fought during the war formed loose alliances dedicated to one purpose: making certain we never rose again. Angels lead the largest coalition, calling themselves the choir, operating with the sanction of heaven itself, convinced that finishing what the failed ritual started is a holy obligation. Fallen angels, ironically, hate devils even more than the angels do, and hunt independently in smaller, more vicious bands they call Talon cells. The Yukai clans mostly keep to their own territories but will join hunts when devil enclaves grow bold enough to threaten their borders. And the dragon clans? She paused. The dragon clans mostly stay out of it. Old grudges, older pride. But when a devil enclave does something foolish enough to draw their attention, they do not forgive easily. That's a lot of enemies, Issei said quietly. That is every enemy, Celine corrected. There is no neutral party left on this world where devils are concerned. Humanity mostly does not know we still exist, and the few human factions that do treat encountering a devil as a rumor at best, a myth at worst. We survive by being small, and quiet, and beneath notice. It is not survival so much as it is a very long, very patient dying. Drake's voice rumbled softly within Issei's mind. This is worse than I anticipated, partner. An entire world's worth of grudges, all aimed at a single, dwindling target. Can we fix it? Issei murmured back, low enough that Celine wouldn't catch the words as speech directed at anyone but himself. I do not know, Drake admitted, which from a dragon prone to sweeping declarations of confidence, unsettled Issei more than any admission of certain doom could have. But I know that we are going to try, because I have watched you refuse to accept smaller impossibilities than this one before, and I have learned not to bet against your stubbornness. Celine was watching him with an expression Issei couldn't quite place, somewhere between curiosity and cautious hope. You go quiet like that often? She asked. Talking to something only you can hear? My partner has opinions, Issei said. A lot of them. Most of them unsolicited. Your partner, Celine repeated slowly. The presence Lucian sensed within your sacred gear. It is sentient. He's a dragon. Drake. The Welsh dragon, back where I'm from, one of the 2 heavenly dragons sealed into sacred gears. Big deal, apparently, though I mostly just think of him as an extremely opinionated roommate who lives in my left arm. Celine's eyebrows rose, the first genuinely surprised expression he'd seen cross her composed face. The Welsh dragon. Drake the Red Dragon Emperor. She said the name carefully, like something out of an old text finally confirmed real. There are records of him even here, though we assume those legends belong to a different age entirely, if they were ever true at all. If what Lucian sensed within you truly is Drake, then you are carrying power that predates the failed ritual by millennia. Power from before this world's devils were ever weakened. I take it that's useful, Issei said. Useful does not begin to cover it, Celine said, and for the first time there was real intensity in her voice, something sharp and hungry beneath the careful formality. If the steward is right about what you might become for us, and if you truly carry a heavenly dragon within you, then you may be the first genuine advantage this enclave has held in 300 years. No pressure, Issei muttered. None at all, Celine said, and this time there was the faintest, driest thread of humor in it, enough to suggest that whoever she'd been before 300 years of grinding survival had worn down her edges, some sliver of that person was still in there. They continued the walk, Celine pointing out the boundaries of the inhabited enclave, the watchtowers manned by exhausted-looking sentries, the makeshift barracks that had once been noble estates before space became too precious for luxury. Issei watched the devils they passed, noted the way children were kept close, the way adults moved with weapons never quite out of reach, the way every conversation dropped to a murmur whenever they passed near the outer wards, as though the enclave itself was holding its breath, waiting for the day the wards finally failed. It reminded him, in the worst way, of every story he'd ever heard about villages living in the shadow of something terrible, except here the terrible thing wasn't a monster in the woods. It was an entire world. How long until the hunters that were converging when I arrived actually get here? Issei asked. Celine's jaw tightened. That is what the steward is currently trying to determine. Your arrival caused enough of a disturbance that several hunting parties in the region will have noticed. Whether they investigate immediately or wait to gather more information before committing forces, we cannot say. But I would not expect more than a few days of quiet before someone comes to see what broke 4 of our outer wards without warning. A few days, Issei repeated. He thought about that, about the weight of what Lucien had asked of him, about the size of the task in front of him against the smallness of the time he had to prepare for it. Drake. How fast can we actually get stronger? Realistically, Drake said, faster than you think, if you are willing to work the way you worked when Vela first humiliated you into taking your training seriously. This world's ambient magic, weak as it is for devils, is saturated with old power from before the ritual failure. There are currents here I have not felt since the earliest ages of our own world. If we can tap into them properly, your growth could be considerably accelerated. How accelerated? I make no promises. But I would rather test the limits of accelerated than sit here calculating margins while an entire race waits to see if you meant what you said in that war room. Issei allowed himself a small, grim smile. Yeah. Me too. Celine had stopped walking, watching him again with that same unreadable expression. You keep speaking as though the outcome of this is already decided. As though there is no version of events where you simply decide this is not your fight, and leave us to whatever comes. There isn't, Issei said simply. I don't really do the leaving thing. Ask anyone who's ever tried to talk me out of a fight I'd already decided to have. That is either extraordinary loyalty, Celine said, or extraordinary foolishness. On this world I have learned those two things often look identical from the outside. Maybe, Issei admitted. But where I'm from, I learned that the difference between them usually just comes down to whether you win. For a long moment, Celine said nothing, studying him with an intensity that made Issei feel, not for the first time since waking in this strange world, distinctly like he was being weighed on some invisible scale. Then she nodded once, and something in her posture shifted, some wall coming down by a fraction of an inch. Then let us make certain you win, she said. Come. There is someone else you need to meet before the steward calls another council. If you are going to become this enclave's guardian, you should meet the ones who will actually be fighting beside you, not just the ones giving the orders. She led him down a narrower passage, away from the grand ruined plazas and toward what Issei could tell, even from a distance, was some kind of training ground, the clash of practice weapons and the low murmur of instruction drifting up through the tunnel ahead of them. As they walked, Drake's voice rumbled once more, quiet and thoughtful. Partner. Whatever this world throws at you, however outmatched this enclave's odds may look on paper, remember this. You have faced devil kings. You have traded blows with gods. You have stared down beings who could unmake this entire realm without truly trying, and you did not blink. A pause waited with something like pride, something like warning. Whatever hunts these people, it has never faced anything like you before. Let that be worth something. It will be, Issei said quietly, and followed Celine into the training grounds, toward the first of many faces he was about to learn belonged to the people he had just decided, with a certainty that surprised even himself, he was going to spend however long it took keeping alive. Chapter 3. The training grounds of the Obsidian Court occupied what had once been an amphitheater, tiered stone seating rising around a wide circular floor scarred with centuries of scorch marks and old repairs. A dozen devils were scattered across it in small clusters, sparring with practice blades, running drills, or simply sitting in exhausted heaps catching their breath. Every one of them turned to look the moment Celine led Issei through the archway, and the training ground went quiet in a ripple that spread outward from the entrance. Word travels fast, Issei murmured. Word always travels fast when hope is involved, Celine said. Try not to disappoint them. They have had precious little of it to spare. A young man broke away from the nearest cluster and jogged over, sword still in hand, sweat plastering dark hair to his forehead. He looked barely older than Issei, with sharp, assessing eyes and the kind of restless energy that Issei recognized immediately as someone who threw himself at every problem head first, and worried about the consequences later. So this is him, the young man said, circling Issei with open, unapologetic curiosity. The one who broke 4 wards falling out of the sky. Cade, Celine said, a warning edge in her voice, the same tone she'd used in the war room. Manners. I have manners, Cade said, not taking his eyes off Issei. I'm being very polite about staring. Despite himself, Issei laughed, some of the tension of the last hour easing out of his shoulders. Issei Hyoudou. And yeah, that was me. Wasn't exactly planned. Cade Marrow. He extended a hand, and Issei shook it, noting the calluses, the strength in the grip, the kind that came from actual use rather than show. Third-generation devil. My grandfather remembers what things were like before the ritual failed. Doesn't talk about it much. Makes him too angry. Cade's gaze flicked briefly toward Celine before returning to Issei, something calculating in it now. The steward thinks you're going to be our miracle. I've heard that before. Wasn't true the last 3 times someone said it. I'm not promising to be a miracle, Issei said honestly. I'm promising to try. There's a difference. Something in Cade's expression shifted, a fraction of skepticism giving way to something more careful. Huh. That's actually the right answer. Most people who show up claiming they'll save us oversell it in the first 5 minutes. He sheathed his sword, some of the aggressive posturing draining out of his stance. Fine. You want to prove it, prove it. Spar with me. Cade, Celine started, but Issei held up a hand. It's fine, he said. I get it. Talk's cheap. Show me, don't tell me. I respect that. He rolled his shoulders, feeling Drake stir with interest inside him. Rules? No magic beyond basic reinforcement, Cade said, already backing toward the center of the ring, drawing his practice blade again. First one knocked down or forced to yield loses. I've been training since I could walk. Fair warning. Noted, Issei said, stepping into the ring after him, aware of the growing crowd of devils gathering along the tiered seats, murmurs rising, the weight of dozens of hopeful, skeptical eyes settling onto him. Partner, Drake said quietly, this would be an excellent moment to demonstrate that whatever this world believes devils have become, you are not measured by their diminished standard. Yeah, Issei murmured back. I got it. Cade moved first, faster than Issei had expected from someone who'd spent the entire walk over projecting careless bravado. The practice blade came in low, testing, and Issei sidestepped it with the ease of someone who had sparred against far worse than a testing strike, catching Cade's wrist on the follow-through and redirecting the momentum past him. Cade recovered quickly, spinning out of the hold, respect flickering openly across his face now. Okay, Cade said, resetting his stance. That wasn't luck. Nope, Issei agreed, and let Cade come at him again. What followed was less a fight than a conversation conducted in movement, Cade probing with increasing intensity, testing speed and reflex and technique, and Issei answering each question with the calm, practiced ease of someone who had trained under monsters and gods and lived to fight another day. He didn't use Drake's power, didn't need to, simply matched Cade's growing intensity with the kind of unhurried confidence that came from having faced opponents who could have ended the fight in a single unguarded moment. The devils in the stands had gone quiet, watching, the murmurs replaced by the sharp intake of breath every time Issei slipped past a strike that should have connected. Finally, on a decisive exchange, Issei caught Cade's blade against his forearm, twisted, and swept the younger devil's legs out from under him in one smooth motion. Cade hit the ground hard, practice blade skittering away, and lay there for a moment, staring up at the bruised sky visible through the amphitheater's open roof, breathing hard. Yield? Issei asked, offering a hand down. Cade stared at the offered hand for a moment, then laughed, short and surprised, and took it, letting Issei pull him up. Yield, he said. That's the fastest anyone's put me down in 2 years. He rubbed the back of his neck, something like genuine respect settling into his expression now, replacing the earlier skepticism entirely. And you weren't even using whatever that sacred gear of yours does. I felt it. There's something enormous sitting right under the surface of you, and you didn't even touch it. Didn't need to, Issei said. You're good. Really good, actually. I wasn't holding back because I didn't respect you enough to try. I was holding back because I didn't want to hurt you on our first meeting. Cade studied him for a long moment, and something settled behind his eyes, some decision reached. Celine, he called out, not looking away from Issei. Tell the steward he can stop worrying about whether this one's the real thing. I don't know what he's going to become for us. But whatever it is, I want to be standing next to him when it happens. A ripple went through the crowd at that, murmurs shifting from wary to something warmer, something that Issei, even without fully understanding the weight of 300 years of grief behind it, could recognize as the first tentative shoot of hope pushing up through very hard, very tired ground. Careful, Issei said, mostly to himself, mostly to Drake. Don't want to promise more than I can deliver. You have never once, in all our years together, delivered less than you promised, Drake said, and there was no teasing in it now, only the steady, ancient certainty of a partner who had watched him grow from a boy obsessed with something shallow into someone capable of shouldering weights like this one without flinching. Do not doubt yourself now, of all moments. Celine approached as the crowd began to disperse back into their drills, murmuring excitedly amongst themselves, and there was something different in the way she looked at him now too, the careful, clinical assessment replaced by something warmer, something almost like relief. That, she said, was well done. Cade does not offer respect easily. His family lost an entire generation to a hunting party 8 years ago. He has earned the right to be difficult to impress. I'm sorry, Issei said quietly. Everyone here has a story like his, Celine said. You will hear 100 of them before you have been here a month, if you stay that long. It is, I am sorry to say, simply what surviving here costs. She studied him a moment longer. The steward wants to convene a full council at dusk to discuss what comes next, including what training regimen might actually accelerate your strength before the hunters that notice your arrival decide to investigate. Until then, you should eat, and rest, and let the Enclave begin to believe that what happened here today was not simply a fluke. I don't really do resting well, Issei admitted. Not when there's this much to do. I am beginning to suspect that about you, Celine said, and this time, the corner of her mouth curved into something that was unmistakably, if briefly, a real smile. Come. I will show you where you can eat, at least, even if I cannot convince you to rest. And you can tell me more about this world of yours, where devils are strong enough that stories like Cade's simply do not happen. I find, strangely, that I want to hear it. Even knowing it will only remind me of everything we lost. Issei fell into step beside her, aware of Drake settling into a thoughtful quiet within him, aware of the weight of dozens of hopeful eyes still lingering on his back as he crossed the training ground, aware, more than anything, of the growing, solidifying certainty that whatever this world demanded of him, he was not going to walk away from it. It's a good world, he said finally, answering Celine's unspoken question as they left the amphitheater behind. Rias, the president of my club back home, she's a devil, and she's basically fearless. Stubborn as anything. Sona's sharp enough to run circles around people twice her age. Even Surzex, one of the actual devil kings, he's terrifyingly powerful and somehow still one of the kindest people I've ever met. He paused, throat tightening slightly with something unexpected, something like homesickness layered over something else entirely. I want you to understand that world isn't some impossible fantasy. It's real. It exists. Which means this isn't the natural order of things. Devils being hunted to the edge of extinction, that's not what's supposed to happen. Something broke here that shouldn't have stayed broken for 300 years. Celine was quiet for a long moment, processing that, something complicated moving behind her composed expression. You intend to fix it, she said finally. It wasn't a question. I intend to try, Issei said. Starting today. Then, Celine said, let us make sure you have the strength to actually manage it, because good intentions have buried more of my people than our enemies ever have. She glanced sideways at him, something almost fond creeping into the assessment now. Come, Guardian. Your first lesson in this world begins now, whether you rest first or not. Issei allowed himself a small smile as he followed her deeper into the heart of the last standing devils of a broken world, Drade quiet and thoughtful within him, the weight of an entire dying race's hopes settling onto his shoulders with a heaviness that should have terrified him, and instead, strangely, steadied him, the way purpose always had. Chapter 4. Dusk on a world with 3 moons was a strange, layered thing, the bruised purple sky deepening into violet, then indigo, then a red so dark it looked almost black, each moon rising at its own pace until the sky was a patchwork of competing light. Issei stood on the same balcony Celine had shown him hours earlier, watching the wards shimmer brighter as the ambient light faded, and tried to organize his thoughts before the council Lucien had called. "You're quiet," Drake observed. "For you, that is either a sign of great wisdom or great worry." "I am inclined to guess the latter. I keep thinking about the numbers," Issei admitted. 3,000 people. 12 enclaves. 300 years of losing. That's not a war I can win by punching hard enough. No, Drake agreed. It is not. Which means you will need to think like something other than a boy who solves problems with his fists, however much that has served you until now. A pause, thoughtful. Tell me, partner. In our world, what turned the tide whenever the odds looked hopeless? Was it always raw strength? Issei considered that. No. Sometimes it was. But a lot of the time it was because someone found an angle nobody else saw. Or because people who shouldn't have trusted each other decided to anyway. Then perhaps that is the shape of the answer here as well, Drake said. Strength will matter. You will need it, and we will build it, faster than this world has any right to expect. But strength alone did not save a dying race in 300 years of trying. Something else will be required. Perhaps it already occurred to that old steward, which is why he called you into his war room within minutes of your waking, instead of locking you in a cell to be studied first. That thought settled uncomfortably in Issei's chest. Lucien had gambled everything on him being exactly what he claimed to be, without any proof beyond a boy's word and a dragon's reputation from stories 300 years stale. That kind of desperate faith deserved to be honored, not squandered. Celine found him there as the last of the light faded and the wards blazed fully into their nighttime brilliance, layer upon layer of shimmering protection wringing the heart of the enclave like a hell breath. The council is gathering, she said. The steward wants you present from the start this time. No more explaining after the fact. She studied his face in the ward light. You look like a man carrying something heavy. 3,000 somethings, Issei said. Give or take. Celine's expression softened, just slightly. That is either the correct amount of weight to carry, or entirely too much for one person to bear alone. I have not yet decided which. She gestured toward the passage leading back down into the mountain. Either way, you are not walking into that council chamber without support. Whatever the steward decides tonight, you will not be facing it as a stranger who fell out of the sky. You have already begun becoming something else to these people. I watched it happen this afternoon, in that training ring. They walked together back into the depths of the obsidian court, and this time, Issei noticed, the devils they passed in the halls no longer dropped their eyes and hurried past. Several nodded to him, small gestures, tentative, but real. Word of the sparring match had clearly traveled through the enclave in the hours since, carried on the same current of desperate hope Celine had warned him about. The war room was fuller this time than it had been that morning. A dozen more devils crowded around the long map table, Lucien standing at its head with the same iron composure, though something in his posture had shifted, some tension eased by whatever reports had reached him in the intervening hours. Kate stood near the front now, no longer at the back with his arms crossed in skepticism, and offered Issei a short nod as he entered. Guardian, Lucien said, and Issei noted the title had solidified into something used without irony now. No longer a hypothetical role but a settled fact. We have gathered fresh reports. I will not soften them for you. You should hear the truth of what you have chosen to stand against. Go ahead, Issei said. Lucien gestured to a younger devil at the edge of the table, who unrolled a fresh map, this one marked with new symbols in urgent red. 3 separate hunting parties have altered course toward this enclave in the hours since your arrival. 2 are choir patrols, angel forces operating under heaven's sanction, moving to investigate the war disturbance directly. The 3rd is a Talon cell, fallen angels operating independently, and Talon cells are considerably less interested in investigation than they are in extermination. His scarred jaw tightened. Best estimates put the nearest choir patrol at 4 days out. The Talon cell, moving faster and less carefully at 6. We have some time. Not much. 4 days, Issei repeated, feeling the weight of that number settle into his stomach. 4 days to prepare, 4 days to strengthen what wards we can, and 4 days for you to become whatever this enclave needs you to be when that patrol arrives, Lucien said. I will not lie to you and tell you that is sufficient time. But it is the time we have, and I have learned, across 300 years of losing slowly, that complaining about the time available accomplishes nothing except wasting more of it. Then let's not waste it, Issei said. Drake thinks the magic in this world might let us accelerate my training faster than normal. What resources do you have? Training grounds, texts, anything that might help me understand how devil magic works here specifically, since apparently it's different from what I'm used to. A murmur went through the gathered devils, something like surprised approval at the directness of the question. Lucian's expression, unreadable as it had been all day, shifted into something that might, on a less severe face, have been called satisfaction. We have what remains of the Obsidian Quartz library, he said. Diminished from what it once was, but still the largest collection of devil magical theory left on this world. We have training grounds, sparring partners, and every scrap of knowledge this enclave has scraped together across 3 centuries of desperate survival. What we do not have is time to waste on theory when practice will teach faster. Celine, steward. You will oversee his training directly. You were, before the ritual failure destroyed most of what our bloodline could have become, considered one of the more promising war mages this enclave has produced in a generation. If anyone here can help him understand the shape of devil magic as it exists now, and as it might have existed before, it is you. Celine straightened, something serious and determined settling over her features. Understood, steward. Cade, Lucian continued, you will handle combat conditioning. Whatever raw magical strength the Guardian develops, it will mean little if he cannot apply it under real pressure. You saw this afternoon that he has skill. Sharpen it further. Push him harder than you pushed yourself today. Cade grinned, sharp and eager. Gladly. The rest of you, Lucian said, addressing the wider council now, will begin fortifying every layer of ward we currently maintain, and preparing contingencies should the worst come before we are ready for it. I want every able body contributing to our defense within the hour. We have 4 days. We will not waste a single one of them. The council dispersed into a flurry of purposeful motion, orders given and received, the war room emptying out into a dozen different directions of urgent preparation. Issei remained where he was for a moment, watching it happen, feeling something settle into place inside his chest, some sense of purpose sharpening into focus the way it always did right before a fight he'd already decided he couldn't afford to lose. 4 days, he murmured, mostly to Drake. 4 days, Drake agreed. It has been longer since we trained properly, partner. I confess, some part of me has missed it. There is a particular satisfaction in growing stronger for a reason that actually matters, rather than simply because pride demanded it. You think we can actually be ready in time? I think, Drake said, that this world is about to learn precisely why the other heavenly dragon and I earn the names we carry. And I think you are about to remember precisely why every enemy who ever underestimated you lived just long enough to regret it. A pause, warmer now, something almost like affection beneath the ancient dragon's usual gruffness. Rest tonight, partner, because tomorrow, we begin in earnest, and I intend to make certain that when that choir patrol arrives in 4 days, they find something standing between them and this enclave that this broken world has never once had reason to fear before. Celine approached as the room emptied, offering him a small, tired smile that nonetheless carried more warmth than anything she'd shown him since he'd woken in this strange, bruised sky world. Come, Guardian, she said. Let me show you the library, at least, before you insist on skipping rest entirely. If we are going to rebuild 300 years of lost strength in 4 days, we may as well begin tonight. Issei fell into step beside her, the weight of the coming days settling onto his shoulders, heavy and real and, strangely, exactly the kind of weight he had spent his whole strange, unlikely life learning how to carry. Lead the way, he said, and meant it. Outside, beyond the shimmering layers of the obsidian quartz wards, in the deepening dark beneath 3 competing moons, something vast and holy and utterly convinced of its own righteousness was already turning its slow, patient attention toward the enclave that had, for the first time in 300 years, just found a reason to stop merely surviving and start, however cautiously, hoping again. It would take more than 4 days to find out whether that hope was justified. But 4 days was, at least, a beginning. And Issei Hyoudou had never once, in any world, in any lifetime, been the kind of person who wasted a beginning once it had been given to him. Chapter 5. The library of the Obsidian Court occupied 3 interconnected caverns deep beneath the training grounds, shelves carved directly into the stone rising 3 stories high, connected by narrow spiral staircases and walkways that creaked faintly underfoot. Most of the shelves stood half empty, gaps where books had clearly been lost, burned, or simply crumbled to dust across 3 centuries of neglect and desperate survival. But what remained was still staggering in scope, and Issei found himself slowing as he took it in, the sheer accumulated weight of a civilization's memory pressed into every surface. It used to fill 6 caverns, Celine said, watching him take it in. This is what survived when the Third Enclave fell 40 years ago, and the survivors carried what they could hear. We lost more knowledge in that single collapse than in the previous century combined. How do you decide what to save when something like that happens? Issei asked quietly. You don't, Celine said. You grab what's closest and you run, and you spend years afterward grieving everything you didn't have hands enough to carry. She said it without visible emotion, the flat, practiced delivery of someone who had told this story, or one like it, too many times to let it show on her face anymore. Come. This section holds what remains of our theoretical texts on devil magic, from before and after the failure. It is not organized as well as it should be. We have not had the luxury of proper archivists in decades. She led him to a long table near the center of the largest cavern, already stacked with a handful of thick, leather-bound volumes that someone, presumably at Lucien's instruction, had pulled in advance. Celine took a seat across from him and drew the topmost volume close, flipping through pages of dense, elegant script that Issei couldn't read at all. This is written in Old Abyssal, she said, noting his expression. The formal language of devil magical theory before the failure. Most of our people cannot read it fluently anymore. I can, mostly, though it is slow going. Let me summarize what matters. She traced a finger down the page, translating as she went. Devil magic, as it existed before the ritual failure, drew from what the old texts call the deep current, an internal wellspring of demonic energy tied directly to bloodline and lineage. The stronger the bloodline, the deeper the current, the more power available to draw from. And the failed ritual damaged that current, Issei said. Damaged is a generous word. It severed most of it. What remains is closer to a trickle where there was once a river. Every devil born since draws from that same diminished trickle, regardless of how strong their bloodline theoretically should be. Celine turned another page. This is why raw power alone has never been a viable strategy for us since the failure. There simply is not enough of it left to work with, no matter how talented or determined an individual devil might be. So how does that help me? Issei asked. I'm not drawing from a devil bloodline. Whatever's inside me is a sacred gear, and drag, and neither of those come from this world's broken current at all. Celine looked up at him, something sharpening in her expression. Precisely. Whatever damaged our bloodline 300 years ago has no claim on you. You are not drawing from a trickle. If the old texts are accurate about how the deep current functioned before the failure, and if your sacred gear draws power the way I suspect it does, you may have access to something this world has not seen functioning at full strength in 3 centuries. Drag, Issei murmured, you catching this? I am, the dragon rumbled, and there was real interest in his voice now, sharp and focused. Ask her what she knows about how the current interacted with external power sources, before the failure. If devils here once drew strength from bonds, from pacts, the way devils in our world form contracts and peerages, that could matter enormously. Issei relayed the question, and Celine's brow furrowed as she flipped further into the volume, scanning several pages before finding what she was looking for. Peerage bonds, she said slowly, reading. Yes. Before the failure, devils of sufficient standing could form what the old texts call blood contracts, formal bonds with other beings that allowed shared access to magical strength, each party strengthening the other through the bond itself. It is described here as one of the primary methods by which the old devil lords built their power beyond what bloodline alone could provide. She looked up. We do not use this anymore. After the failure, the current grew too thin to spare on anyone but the bonded devil themselves. Forming a blood contract now would be considered wasteful, Even foolish, given how little most devils have to share in the first place. But I'm not most devils, Issei said slowly, understanding building. If my strength doesn't come from the same broken current, then a bond with me wouldn't be draining something already too thin to spare. It would be adding something new. Celine stared at him for a long moment, something like realization dawning behind her eyes. That is either an extraordinarily good idea, or an extraordinarily dangerous one. Blood contracts are not undertaken lightly even under ideal circumstances. They tie two beings' magical fates together in ways that cannot easily be undone. And we have no precedent for what such a bond might do when one party is drawing from power as ancient and as vast as what you carry. Would it work? Issei asked. Theoretically? Theoretically, Celine said carefully, it might do more than simply strengthen individual devils who bonded with you. It might, if the old texts are to be believed, allow a fraction of that bonded strength to flow back into the wider current those devils are still connected to by blood. A ripple effect. Small at first. But not nothing. She closed the book slowly, looking at him with an expression that had shifted somewhere between caution and something that looked dangerously close to hope again. You are describing something that has not been attempted in 300 years, Guardian. If it worked even partially, it could change everything about how this war has been fought. If it failed, or worse, if it went wrong in a direction the old texts do not account for, the consequences could be catastrophic, for you and for whoever you bonded with. Then we test it carefully, Issei said. Not with everything on the line at once. Start small. Start with someone who trusts you enough to risk it, Celine said quietly, and there was something in the way she said it that made Issei look up and meet her eyes directly. Would you? He asked. The question hung in the cavern air for a long moment, the weight of it settling over both of them. Celine did not answer immediately, her gaze steady on his, some complicated calculation working behind her composed features, 300 years of careful, hard-won caution weighing against the small, stubborn flicker of hope that had been growing in her chest since the moment this strange boy had fallen out of an impossible sky and claimed, without hesitation, that a world where devils were not hunted like game actually existed. Ask me again, she said finally, once we understand more of what we would actually be attempting. I am not opposed. I am careful. There is a difference, and after 300 years of watching hope get people killed, I have learned to respect it. A ghost of a smile crossed her face, softer than anything he'd seen from her yet. But ask me again, Guardian. I suspect, before these 4 days are through, my answer may very well be yes. Drake's voice rumbled with quiet satisfaction within Issei's chest. Partner, I believe we have just found the shape of the answer I mentioned earlier. Strength alone will not save this world's devils. But strength, shared and multiplied through bonds this world has forgotten how to trust, just might. Issei looked around the vast, half-empty library, at the gaps on the shelves where 3 centuries of grief had swallowed whole libraries of lost knowledge, at Celine's careful, hopeful eyes across the table, and felt something solidify inside him, a plan beginning to take shape from the wreckage of a broken world's oldest despair. 4 days, he said quietly. Let's make them count. Agreed, Celine said, and pulled the next volume close, and together, beneath the weight of a mountain and the light of 3 competing moons, the last theoretical devil war mage of a dying enclave and the first true heavenly dragon this world had seen in 300 years began, in earnest, the long work of rebuilding a river from what remained of a trickle. Outside, the wards held. For now, somewhere beyond the shimmering layers of protection, beneath the same bruised sky and the same 3 indifferent moons, a choir patrol adjusted its course by a few careful degrees, angel wings catching starlight as they moved with slow, methodical certainty toward an enclave they still believed to be exactly as helpless as every devil territory they had hunted for the last 300 years. They had no reason yet to expect otherwise. They had no reason yet to know that something ancient and patient, and utterly unwilling to lose had just opened its eyes in the last place they thought to look for resistance. They would learn. 4 days, Issei had said. 4 days felt, to the 2 devils bent over a candlelit table full of old, half-forgotten books, like both an impossibly short span of time and somehow, exactly enough. Chapter 6. The first day of training began before the second moon had finished setting, and it began, much to Issei's private amusement, with Celine shaking him awake by the shoulder with the brisk efficiency of someone who had clearly decided sleep was a luxury this enclave could no longer afford to indulge in. Up, she said, already dressed, a satchel of books slung over one shoulder. The deep current theory will mean nothing if we do not test it while daylight allows visibility across the lower training ground. Cade is waiting. It's not even morning, Issei mumbled, dragging himself upright. It is morning enough, Celine said, entirely unmoved. You have 3 days and some hours remaining before the choir patrol arrives. I do not intend to waste any of them on your preference for later starts. Drake's voice rumbled with something suspiciously close to amusement. I find myself liking her already, partner. Traitor, Issei muttered, but he got up anyway. The lower training ground, when they reached it, was already busy, devils running drills in the pale, 3-moon dawn, the scrape and clash of practice weapons echoing off ancient stone. Cade was waiting near the center, arms crossed, a look on his face that suggested he had slept even less than Issei had. Morning, Cade said. Celine tells me you two spent half the night reading old theory instead of resting. Hope it was worth it. It might be, Issei said. We think there's a way to share strength. A blood contract, the old texts called it. Something devils used to do before the failure. Cade's expression shifted, something wary and hopeful warring behind his eyes. I've heard of those. Grandfather mentioned them once, years ago, before he stopped talking about the old days entirely. Said they were how the great houses built their strength beyond bloodline alone. He studied Issei for a long moment. You're saying you want to try one? With who? That's still being decided, Celine said smoothly, before Issei could answer, and something in the careful neutrality of her tone made Cade's eyebrows climb, though he had the tact not to press the question further. Fine, Cade said instead. Theory later. Let's see what you've actually got first, because if we're building some kind of new strategy around your strength, I want real numbers, not just a good showing in a friendly spar. What followed was, by Issei's own private estimation, one of the more grueling mornings he'd endured in recent memory, and he had trained under Azazel, who considered mercy a design flaw. Cade drove him through drill after drill, testing not just his combat instincts but his stamina, his reaction speed, his ability to draw on Drake's power in short, controlled bursts rather than the overwhelming floods he was used to unleashing against genuine threats. Celine observed from the sidelines, book open, occasionally calling out observations in clipped, analytical tones that made it clear she was cataloging every reaction with the precision of someone building a case study. Your boost function, she said, during a break as Issei caught his breath, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cool morning air, it multiplies existing power rather than generating new power outright. Correct? Yeah, Issei said. Every 10 seconds, it doubles whatever I've already got. Then theoretically, Celine said, already writing, if we can establish even a thin thread of connection between your power and the enclave's ambient current, the compounding effect of your boost could multiply not just your own strength, but whatever fraction of the current you draw through that connection. It would not be like your sacred gear boosting a devil directly. It would be your sacred gear boosting the current itself, which every devil here draws from to some degree. Drake made a low, considering sound within Issei's chest. That is either brilliant or catastrophically dangerous, depending entirely on how carefully it is executed. Boosting an entire region's ambient magical current uncontrolled could have consequences well beyond simple power growth. Tell her that, partner. Issei relayed the warning, and Celine nodded slowly, unsurprised. I assumed as much. Which is why we test cautiously. Small connections first. A single bond carefully monitored before we consider anything larger. She closed her book. Cade. How is he holding up, from your assessment? Better than he should be, this early, Cade admitted, some of his earlier skepticism entirely gone now, replaced by something closer to genuine respect. His reflexes are already faster than mine, and he's barely using the dragon at all yet. If we actually get this bond theory working, I don't want to imagine what he looks like by the time that choir patrol shows up. Let's find out, Issei said, rolling his shoulders, ignoring the ache already settling into his muscles. Celine. You said ask you again once we understood more? I think we understand enough to try something small. You still willing? The training ground went quiet around them, several nearby devils slowing their drills to listen, word of the proposal apparently having already spread through the Enclave's efficient rumor network sometime in the night. Celine held his gaze for a long moment, something steady and deliberate in her expression. 300 years of careful caution weighed one final time against the stubborn, growing certainty that this strange boy who had fallen out of an impossible sky might actually be exactly what he claimed to be. Yes, she said finally, quiet but certain. I am willing. Then let's do this properly, Issei said, and carefully. Drake, walk us through it. The ritual? Once Drake explained the theory and Celine cross-referenced it against the old text she carried, turned out to be simpler in mechanics than either of them had expected, though no less significant for its simplicity. It required only a shared exchange of magical signature, a deliberate opening of will on both sides, and a kind of trust that could not be faked or forced. Celine knelt across from Issei in the center of the training ground, the gathered devils forming a loose, watchful circle around them, and extended her hand. However this changes things, she said, I want you to understand that I am choosing this. Not because the steward ordered it. Not because this enclave is desperate enough to gamble on anything. Because I have watched you for one day, and something in me believes you are worth the risk. A small, wry twist of her mouth. That is either the most reckless decision I have made in decades, or the wisest. Ask me again in an hour. I'll take either answer, Issei said, and took her offered hand. What happened next was not painful, though it was strange in a way Issei struggled to describe even to himself afterward, a sensation like a door opening somewhere deep inside his chest, warmth flooding outward through the connection formed between his palm and Celine's, Drake's ancient power reaching through that new, fragile thread and touching, for the first time in 300 years, the thin, diminished current running beneath the devil's diminished bloodline. Celine gasped, her grip tightening on his hand, eyes going wide, and for a moment, something flickered around her, faint and golden, an echo of power that the training ground's assembled devils clearly recognized even before they understood what they were seeing, because a ripple of astonished murmurs spread outward through the crowd. Her wings, someone breathed. Look at her wings. Celine's wings, which had been folded neatly against her back all morning, small and unremarkable in the way every devil's wings in this diminished world had become, were larger now, the membrane darker, more solid, edged faintly with the same golden light that had flickered briefly around her. She flexed them experimentally, staring at the change with an expression somewhere between disbelief and something that looked, unmistakably, like the beginning of tears. I felt that, she said, voice unsteady in a way Issei hadn't heard from her yet. For one moment, I felt the current the way the old texts describe it. Not a trickle. A river. She looked at Issei, something raw and overwhelmed breaking through her careful composure for the first time since he'd met her. It worked. It worked, Issei confirmed, feeling the faint, warm pull of the new bond settled somewhere in his chest alongside Drake's steady presence. A small but undeniable connection now anchoring him to this world in a way he hadn't been anchored an hour before. Drake's voice rumbled with quiet, deep satisfaction. Partner, I believe we have just found the beginning of your answer. Imagine what becomes possible when this is not one bond, but dozens. Hundreds. An entire enclave's current, restored not by fixing what broke 300 years ago, but by building something new around it entirely. Around them, the assembled devils had gone from murmuring to something closer to stunned, reverent silence, watching Celine flex wings that had grown visibly stronger in the space of a single ritual, watching the boy who had fallen out of an impossible sky prove, in front of all of them, that whatever hope had been quietly kindling in this dying enclave since his arrival was not simply wishful thinking. Cade broke the silence first, a slow grin spreading across his face. Okay, he said. Okay. Now I actually believe the steward. Sign me up next. Laughter rippled through the crowd, tension breaking into something warmer, and Issei, still catching his breath from the strange, overwhelming intimacy of the bonding ritual, found himself smiling despite the exhaustion already dragging at his limbs. One bond at a time, Celine said, though there was no real reprimand in it, only a kind of dazed wonder still coloring her voice as she turned her newly strengthened wings, watching golden light ripple faintly along their edges. We need to understand the limits of this before we consider expanding it. But Cade. She looked at him, something warm and hopeful in her expression now. Yes. Soon. 3 days, Issei reminded them all, though even he could hear the change in his own voice, the exhaustion of the morning's training giving way to something sharper, more purposeful. 3 days until that patrol arrives. Let's make every hour of them count. Chapter 7. By the second day, word of what had happened in the training ground had spread through every corner of the obsidian court, and Issei woke to find a line of devils already gathering outside the guest chamber Celine had assigned him, waiting with a patience that spoke of people long practiced in waiting for things that rarely came. They want to volunteer, Celine explained, when he found her sorting through the growing crowd with a clipboard she had apparently conjured from somewhere, her expression a careful mixture of professional focus and something warmer underneath. For the bonding. Word travels fast when it means hope, guardian, and faster still when that hope has proved standing in a training ground for everyone to see. Issei looked out at the assembled devils, dozens of them now, families with children tucked close, elderly devils leaning on canes, young fighters like Cade with the restless energy of people who had spent their whole lives being told their strength would never be enough. The weight of all that hope settled over him, heavy and real. I can't bond with everyone at once, he said quietly. Drake, how many can we actually manage safely, this fast? Carefully, and with proper spacing between each ritual to monitor for adverse effects, Drake said, I would estimate no more than 3 to 5 today, if you intend to also continue your own training and remain functional for whatever the choir patrol brings when it arrives. Overextending the bonds too quickly risks weakening the connection's integrity, and we cannot afford failures this early, not when every devil watching is deciding whether to trust this at all. Issei relayed the assessment to Celine, who nodded, already moving through the crowd with brisk efficiency, selecting 5 volunteers with the practiced eye of someone triaging a crisis. Cade was among them, along with an older woman named Yara who had lost both her sons to a hunting party a decade past and fought since with a grim, unrelenting determination that Issei recognized immediately as something close to his own stubbornness. A younger devil named Petra, barely out of her teens, trembling with nervous excitement. 2 others, quieter, watchful, clearly still deciding whether to fully trust the boy who had fallen out of the sky 2 days prior. Each bonding, Issei found, differed slightly depending on the person, the strength of the connection shaped as much by the volunteer's own will and openness as by anything Issei or Drake contributed. Cade's bond came fast and fierce, matching his restless energy, his wings darkening and strengthening within moments, a grin splitting his face as he flexed newly capable muscles. Yara's came slower, more deliberate, tears streaming silently down her weathered face as something long dormant in her diminished current stirred back toward life, murmuring a name Issei didn't recognize, someone lost, someone she was clearly thinking of in that moment. Petra's came with nervous, giggling relief, the young devil laughing in disbelieving joy at wings that had, for the first time in her life, grown strong enough to actually lift her fully off the ground. By the time the 5th bond was complete, Issei was breathing hard, sweat soaking through his shirt again, a bone-deep exhaustion settling into him that even Drake's steady presence couldn't fully mask. That is enough for today, Drake said firmly, before Issei could even consider a 6th. You are not inexhaustible, partner, whatever your stubbornness insists otherwise. Rest, or risk weakening every bond you have already formed. Issei reluctantly agreed, watching the 5 newly bonded devils examine their strengthened forms with expressions ranging from disbelieving joy to quiet, overwhelmed gratitude, and felt something warm settle into his chest despite the exhaustion, a sense of purpose sharpening into something solid and real. This is working, Celine said quietly, coming to stand beside him as the small crowd dispersed, murmuring excitedly amongst themselves. 5 bonds, and already I can feel it, faintly, in the ambient current around the enclave. It is subtle. But it is there. A ripple, just as the old texts predicted. How long until it's more than a ripple? Issei asked. I do not know, Celine admitted. The old texts describe blood contracts between individual devils and powerful patrons, not this kind of widespread, deliberate strengthening of an entire enclave's current. We are, in every sense that matters, writing new theory as we go. She looked at him, something searching in her expression. Does that frighten you? Attempting something with no precedent, no guarantee, 3 days before an enemy patrol arrives expecting to find easy prey? Issei considered the question seriously, feeling the ache in his limbs. The warm pull of 5 new bonds settled alongside Drake's steady presence in his chest, the memory of Yara's tears and Petra's disbelieving laughter, and Cade's fierce, grateful grin. A little, he admitted. But I've learned that the things worth doing usually come with that feeling attached. If it was safe and certain, it probably wouldn't matter this much. Celine studied him for a long moment, something soft and unguarded crossing her face before she caught herself and smoothed it back into her usual careful composure. That is either very wise, she said, or very much the kind of thing a reckless boy tells himself to justify reckless choices. I confess I am no longer certain there is a meaningful difference, where you are concerned. Probably not, Issei agreed, and found himself smiling despite the exhaustion. Come on. Tell me what's next in that book of yours. If we've only got 3 days left, I don't want to waste this afternoon resting when there's more to learn. You just agreed you were exhausted, Celine pointed out. I did, Issei said. Doesn't mean I'm done. Celine shook her head, though the small, exasperated smile tugging at her mouth suggested she was already growing accustomed to exactly this kind of stubbornness, and led him back toward the library, toward the next stack of old, half-forgotten theory waiting to be relearned, tested, and rebuilt into something this broken world had not seen functioning in 300 years. Behind them, in the training ground, 5 newly bonded devils continued examining their strengthened forms beneath the pale light of a rising moon, and word of what had happened there continued spreading outward through the obsidian court's quiet halls, enclave to enclave, whisper to whisper, the first genuine current of hope this dying people had felt in longer than most of them could remember. It would take more than hope to survive what was coming. Issei understood that much clearly, even exhausted, even uncertain of exactly how far this new strength could be pushed before the choir patrol's 4 days ran out. But hope, he had learned across every impossible fight he'd ever waded into, was very rarely nothing. Sometimes it was exactly the thing that made the difference between a fight worth having and a fight already lost before it began. The library work stretched long into the evening, Celine translating passage after passage of old abyssal theory while Issei absorbed what he could, Drake occasionally interjecting with observations drawn from millennia of magical knowledge that predated even the oldest texts on the table. By the time exhaustion finally forced them both to set the books aside, the candles had burned low, and a comfortable, companionable quiet had settled between them that neither seemed particularly eager to break. Can I ask you something? Issei said, as they finally rose to leave. 300 years is a long time to keep fighting a losing battle. What kept this enclave going, before I showed up? What made people keep choosing to survive instead of just giving up? Celine considered the question seriously, gathering the books with careful, methodical movements. Stubbornness, mostly, she said finally. The same kind you carry, I think, though we did not always recognize it as anything other than exhaustion at the time. Every generation told itself the next one might see things change. Every steward before Lucien made the same promise he is making now, that if we simply endured long enough, carefully enough, something would eventually shift in our favor. A faint, tired smile. None of them were wrong to hope that. They were simply unlucky enough not to live to see it proven true. I intend to be luckier. You will be, Issei said, with more certainty than he entirely felt, though the words settled comfortably between them regardless. A promise offered as much to himself as to her. 3 days remained. He intended to make every one of them count. Chapter 8. The third day brought news that shortened the timeline considerably, and it arrived in the form of a scout, a wiry young devil named Tobin who stumbled into the war room mid-morning with windbent cheeks and the particular breathlessness of someone who had flown faster and farther than his body wanted to allow. Steward, he gasped, dropping into a hasty bow before Lucien's stern gaze. The choir patrol. They've changed pace. They're not 4 days out anymore. They'll reach the outer wards by tomorrow evening. The war room went tense and silent, Lucien's jaw tightening as he absorbed the news, Celine's hand finding Issei's wrist in an unconscious, grounding gesture that neither of them commented on. Why the change? Lucien demanded. What altered their approach? Word reached them, Tobin said, still catching his breath. Rumors of something unusual happening in this enclave. Strengthened devils. A stranger with power unlike anything seen here in centuries. They're moving to investigate directly, and moving faster because of it. Command apparently wants confirmation before deciding whether this warrants a larger response. A larger response, Cade repeated grimly. Meaning if they decide we're actually dangerous, they call in more than a single patrol. Meaning exactly that, Lucien confirmed, and Issei watched 300 years of hard-won caution settle over the old steward's scarred features, weighing options with the efficiency of someone who had made this kind of desperate calculation more times than he likely cared to remember. Tomorrow evening, then. Not 4 days. 1. He turned his sharp gaze to Issei. Guardian. Is what you and Celine have built in the last 2 days enough to survive first contact with an actual choir patrol, or do we need to consider evacuation contingencies instead? The question hung heavy in the room, and Issei felt the weight of every eye turned toward him, felt Dre go still and focused within his chest, felt the warm, steady pull of 6 bonded devils now anchored to him through connections still fresh enough to feel fragile. I don't know yet, Issei admitted honestly, because he had learned, across every fight that had ever actually mattered, that false confidence killed people faster than honest uncertainty ever had. But I know we're stronger today than we were 3 days ago, and we're going to be stronger again by tomorrow evening. I want to push the bonding further today, and I want everyone who's willing to spend the rest of today and tonight training as hard as they can manage. If they're coming to investigate rather than commit fully, that means they're not expecting real resistance. That's an advantage if we use it right. Lucien studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then we use it. Celine, continue the bonding, but be selective. I want fighters bonded first, those capable of standing on the front line if this comes to actual combat. Cade, ready every able-bodied devil for combat readiness by nightfall. Tobin, I want eyes on that patrol's exact position every hour from now until they arrive. No surprises. The room dissolved into purposeful motion once more, and Issei found himself swept along in it, the remaining hours blurring into an intense, focused rhythm of bonding rituals and combat drills and hurried strategy sessions that stretched from midday well into the deepening dusk. He bonded with 4 more devils over the course of the afternoon, feeling the ambient current around the enclave grow perceptibly stronger with each new connection, Celine's careful notes, filling page after page with observations that would, she insisted, matter enormously for whatever came after this crisis, assuming they survived it. By the time the third moon rose fully into the bruised evening sky, Issei stood on the same balcony where he'd first watched the wards shimmer into their nighttime brilliance, exhaustion settling deep into every muscle, 10 bonded connections now humming warm and steady alongside Drake's ancient presence in his chest. Celine found him there, her own wings, fully transformed now by their earlier bond, folded loosely against her back. A quiet strength settled into her posture that hadn't been there 4 days ago. 10 bonds, she said, coming to stand beside him. In 3 days. I have reread the old text twice tonight, and I can find no precedent for growth this fast, this significant. Whatever you carry within you, Guardian, it is rewriting assumptions about devil magic that have stood unquestioned for 300 years. Is it enough? Issei asked quietly. For tomorrow? Celine considered the question seriously, her gaze drifting out over the shimmering wards toward the dark horizon where, somewhere beyond sight, a choir patrol was drawing steadily closer. I do not know, she admitted, echoing his own honesty from the war room. But I know that 3 days ago, this enclave had nothing but exhausted wards and grim resignation standing between us and whatever came next. Tonight, we have 10 devils carrying strength this world has not felt in 3 centuries, a steward who has not looked this cautiously hopeful in years, and you. She turned to face him fully. Whatever tomorrow brings, Issei, You have already given this enclave something it had lost the ability to believe in. That matters, regardless of how the fight itself goes. I want more than it mattering, Issei said. I want everyone here to still be alive the day after tomorrow. As do I, Celine said quietly. But I have learned, across 300 years of losing slowly, that certainty is a luxury this world rarely offers. We prepare as thoroughly as we can. We trust the strength we have built. And when tomorrow comes, we meet it together, rather than apart. She held his gaze steadily. That is the only guarantee any of us have ever truly had, guardian, in this world or, I suspect, in yours as well. Issei thought of Rias, of Surzex, of every impossible fight he'd waded into back home with exactly that same uncertain, stubborn faith carrying him through, and found something settling into place inside his chest, steady and resolved despite the exhaustion dragging at his limbs. Together then, he said. Get some rest, Celine. Tomorrow's going to need everything both of us have left to give. You first, she said, a faint, tired smile touching her mouth. You have given considerably more of yourself today than I have. Deal, Issei said, though they both understood, standing there beneath 3 competing moons with a war room's worth of preparation settling into place around them, that neither of them intended to sleep particularly well before tomorrow evening arrived. Drake's voice rumbled low and steady within Issei's chest as they finally turned to leave the balcony, the wards blazing bright and defiant against the darkening sky behind them. 10 bonds, partner. A river beginning to reform from what was once only a trickle. A pause weighted with something that might, in a dragon 3,000 years removed from anything resembling sentiment, have almost been pride. Tomorrow, this world's choir patrol expects to find easy prey waiting behind failing wards. Instead, they are going to find something this world has not had reason to fear in 300 years standing directly in their path. Good, Issei said quietly, following Celine back into the depths of the mountain, toward whatever rest either of them could manage to find before dawn brought them one day closer to a fight neither could afford to lose. Let them be afraid. It's about time somebody was, for a change. Chapter 9. The choir patrol arrived at dusk, exactly as Tobin's hourly reports had predicted, 3 angels descending out of a sky still streaked with the last bruised light of day, their wings catching the glow of the enclave's wards as they touched down a careful distance from the outermost layer, close enough to be seen clearly, far enough to suggest they were not yet committing to open conflict. Issei stood at the front of the small formation Lucien had arranged near the primary gate, flanked by Celine and Cade and the 8 other devils who had bonded with him over the last 3 days, the rest of the Enclave's able-bodied fighters arrayed in careful ranks behind them, close enough to support, far enough back that this first confrontation would read, deliberately, as a controlled negotiation rather than a desperate last stand. Remember, Lucien had told him barely an hour earlier, they are here to investigate, not necessarily to attack. How this goes depends heavily on what they decide about us in these first few minutes. Strength shown carelessly could provoke exactly the larger response we are trying to avoid. Strength hidden entirely accomplishes nothing either. You must show them precisely enough to make them cautious, without making them desperate. Issei had absorbed that advice with the grim understanding that the margin between those 2 outcomes was thinner than he would have liked, and now, watching the 3 angels approach across the scarred ground between the wards and the tree line, he felt Drake settle into a sharp, focused readiness within his chest. The angel in the lead was tall, silver-haired, armored in white and gold that seemed to catch and hold the fading light, her expression carrying the particular serene certainty of someone utterly convinced of the righteousness of her purpose. She stopped a dozen paces from the ward's edge, her 2 companions flanking slightly behind her, and studied the assembled devils with an assessing, almost clinical gaze. I am Ariel, of the choir's 4th wing, she said, her voice carrying easily across the distance, calm and measured. We have come to investigate a significant magical disturbance detected 3 days past. I would speak with whoever leads this enclave. Lucien stepped forward, his scarred face carefully neutral. I am Lucien Ashgrave, steward of the Obsidian Court. You are welcome to state your business, though I will remind you this enclave operates under the standing treaties recognized by your own choir command. Treaties that permit our investigation of unusual magical activity within any devil territory, as I recall them, Ariel said unbothered. And this territory has produced activity unusual enough to warrant direct attention. Ward disturbances powerful enough to register 3 enclaves distant. Reports of devils demonstrating strength this diminished race has not shown in 3 centuries. Her gaze shifted, deliberate and probing, past Lucian to settle directly on Issei. And a stranger, appearing from nowhere, carrying power that does not match any signature on record for this world at all. The weight of her attention settled over Issei like a physical thing, and he felt Drake go very still, watching, waiting. "My name is Issei Hyoudou," he said, meeting her gaze without flinching, because he had learned long ago that showing weakness to someone measuring you for a threat assessment rarely improved the outcome. "I'm not from this world. I ended up here by accident. Since then, I've decided to help this enclave." "Help," Ariel repeated, something faintly sharp entering her measured tone. An interesting choice of word for a stranger who has, in the space of 3 days, apparently begun rebuilding a magical current your choir spent 3 centuries carefully ensuring stayed broken. She took a single step closer, her 2 companions tensing slightly behind her, hands drifting near, weapons still sheathed but clearly ready. "You should understand, stranger, that what you are attempting here is not a small thing. Devils were weakened for reasons my choir considers just and necessary. Reversing that, even partially, is not something heaven will simply overlook." "With respect," Issei said, and he made sure his voice carried the same calm, level certainty Ariel's had, "I don't really care what heaven decided was just 300 years ago. I've seen a world where devils and angels and every other faction found a way to exist without one side hunting the other to the edge of extinction. That balance is possible. I've lived it. What's happening here isn't justice. It's just a very long, very patient massacre, and I'm not going to stand by and let it keep happening if I can help it." A murmur rippled through the assembled devils behind him, something fierce and startled and hopeful all at once, and Ariel's serene composure flickered, just slightly, something calculating entering her gaze as she studied him more closely. "You speak with considerable conviction, for someone who arrived in this conflict 3 days ago," she said. "Do you understand what you are inviting, stranger, by standing here making such claims? My report of this encounter will reach choir command regardless of how this conversation ends. If they decide this enclave represents a genuine, growing threat to the balance we have maintained for 3 centuries, the response that follows will not be a single investigating patrol." "Then let your command decide," Issei said. "But before you make that report, maybe ask yourself something first. In 300 years of hunting devils to near extinction, has that actually made your world safer? Or has it just meant 300 years of grief on one side and empty righteousness on the other, with nothing actually solved?" The words landed heavier than Issei had entirely intended, and for a long moment, Ariel said nothing, her composed expression cracking just slightly around something that looked, unexpectedly, like genuine consideration rather than immediate dismissal. "That," she said finally, quiet enough that only those closest could hear it clearly, "is not a question I am accustomed to being asked so directly." She studied him a moment longer, something shifting behind her serene eyes, some calculation Issei couldn't fully read. "I will make my report as observed fact, stranger, without embellishment or exaggeration. What choir command decides from it is beyond my authority to determine. But I will say this." Her gaze swept once more over the assembled devils, over their strengthened wings, their steady, unwavering formation, before returning to Issei. "Whatever you are building here, it is unlike anything my choir has encountered in 3 centuries of maintaining this world's balance. That alone will draw far more attention than a single patrol, regardless of how carefully I phrase my report." "I understand," Issei said. "And I'm not going to stop building it." Something almost like respect flickered briefly across Ariel's face, quickly smoothed away beneath her practiced serenity. "Then I suspect, stranger, that we will meet again, under circumstances considerably less restrained than this one." She inclined her head, a formal, measured gesture, and turned, her 2 companions falling into step behind her as they retreated back toward the tree line, wings unfurling in preparation for flight. Steward Ashgrave. "My report will be filed within the day. I would recommend preparing this enclave for whatever attention it draws in the days following." They rose into the darkening sky and were gone within moments, leaving the assembled devils standing in tense, uncertain silence beneath 3 competing moons, watching the space where the angels had disappeared with expressions caught somewhere between relief and dawning apprehension. "Well," Kate said finally, breaking the silence with a short, unsteady laugh. "That could have gone worse." "It could also go considerably worse very soon," Lucian said grimly, though there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested even he had expected a far more immediate and violent confrontation than the one that had just concluded. "Guardian, whatever you said to her, it bought us time rather than costing it. I do not know if that will hold once her report reaches choir command in full. But it is more than I expected from a first contact, and I will take it." Issei felt the tension finally begin to drain from his shoulders, exhaustion rushing back, and now that the immediate threat had passed, Drake's presence settling into something thoughtful and quietly approving within his chest. "That was well handled, partner," the dragon said. "Though I suspect you have just guaranteed this conflict grows considerably larger before it grows any smaller." "Yeah," Issei murmured back, watching the space in the sky where 3 angels had vanished, feeling the first day of what he already understood would be a very long fight settle fully onto his shoulders. "I know. But at least now they know we're not just going to lie down and let it happen quietly anymore." Around him, the gathered devils were beginning to break formation, murmuring excitedly amongst themselves, the tension of the last hour giving way to something cautiously jubilant, disbelief mixing with relief in equal measure. Kate clapped a hand on Issei's shoulder, hard enough to stagger him slightly, grinning despite the exhaustion visible in his own posture. "You stood there and talked back to a choir angel like she was just another training partner," Kate said, shaking his head. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone do that and walk away still breathing. Grandfather's going to want to hear every word of it, and he's not going to believe a bit of it until I swear on our bond that it's true." "I wasn't trying to be brave," Issei admitted. "I just meant what I said. Every word of it." "That's exactly why it worked," Yara said, approaching with the quiet, steady authority she carried in everything she did, her strengthened wings folded loosely against her back. "Conviction that isn't performance is rare enough that even angels notice the difference. I have watched braver speeches than yours fail because everyone in the room could tell they were rehearsed for effect. Yours wasn't." She studied him a moment longer, something maternal and approving in her weathered expression. "My sons would have liked you, Guardian. They believed in exactly that kind of stubborn honesty, right up until the day it wasn't enough to save them." Her voice caught only slightly on the admission, quickly steadied. "I am glad, for once, that it seems to have been enough today." Issei didn't know how to answer that, the weight of her grief and her hope both resting heavily in the same handful of words, so he simply reached out and clasped her hand, the bond between them humming faintly warm at the contact, and let that stand in for whatever words felt inadequate to offer instead. Celine came to stand beside him, her strengthened wings folded loosely against her back, watching the same empty sky with an expression that mixed cautious relief with something steadier, more resolved. 300 years, she said quietly, and today is the first day anyone has stood in front of a choir patrol and made them actually stop and think, rather than simply comply or die. She looked at him, something warm and fierce in her gaze now. "Whatever comes next, Guardian, you have already changed something in this enclave that cannot easily be undone. I hope you understand that." "I'm counting on it," Issei said, and turned with her back toward the mountain, toward whatever preparations the days ahead would demand, carrying with him the quiet, steady certainty that whatever choir command decided in response to today's encounter, the last standing devils of the Obsidian Court would not be facing it alone, or unprepared, ever again. Chapter 10. The days following Ariel's departure passed in a strange, suspended tension, the enclave caught between the relief of having survived first contact and the dread of not knowing exactly what judgment choir command would eventually hand down. Issei used the uncertainty the only way he knew how, throwing himself into training and bonding with a focus that left Celine alternating between admiration and genuine concern for his well-being. "You cannot bond with the entire enclave in a week," she told him on the 4th morning since Ariel's visit, finding him already awake and working through combat forms alone in the amphitheater before dawn had fully broken. 3,000 devils, Issei. Even if your strength allows it eventually, your body has limits, and I would rather not discover them by watching you collapse mid-ritual. I know, Issei said, not stopping his forms, though he slowed enough to acknowledge her properly. I'm not trying to bond with everyone right now. I'm trying to make sure the ones who are bonded are actually ready for whatever comes next. There's a difference between having strength and knowing how to use it. Celine studied him for a moment, then walked out onto the training floor and settled into a ready stance across from him, drawing a practice blade from where it hung at her hip. Then let me help you make sure of it properly, rather than exhausting yourself training alone before the sun has even risen. They sparred as the 3 moons faded and the bruised sky slowly lightened toward its version of dawn, and Issei found himself genuinely impressed by how much Celine's fighting had sharpened in the days since their bond, her movements carrying a confidence and reach that hadn't been there when he'd first watched her walk into his chamber a week ago. She was not Cade's kind of fighter, all aggressive momentum and restless energy. She fought the way she did everything else, carefully, deliberately, each strike considered before it was thrown, and Issei had to work harder than he expected to keep pace with the calculated precision of her attacks. You've improved, he said, catching her blade against his forearm and redirecting it past him, the same move he'd used against Cade a week ago, though Celine recovered from it faster than Cade had. I have had considerable motivation, Celine said, disengaging and resetting her stance. 300 years of learning to fight with a trickle of strength teaches a certain kind of discipline. Having an actual river to draw from now simply means that discipline finally has enough fuel to matter. She struck again, faster this time, and Issei found himself genuinely pressed to block it cleanly. I do not intend to waste this second chance being anything less than the fighter I always should have been. They continued for another hour, the training ground gradually filling around them as other devils arrived for their own morning drills, several pausing to watch the Guardian and the Steward's chosen war mage spar with an intensity that had clearly become something of a fixture in the Enclave's daily rhythm over the past week. By the time they finally called a halt, both breathing hard, sweat-soaked despite the cool morning air, a small crowd had gathered, and Cade among them wore an expression of open, delighted approval. You two keep this up, he called out, and half the Enclave's going to start placing bets on who wins these mornings. I would win, Celine said immediately, sheathing her blade with a small, satisfied smile. You're saying that because I let you catch that last strike, Issei said. I am saying it because it is true, and because you are a poor liar about your own effort levels, Celine said, and the answering laugh that broke out of Issei surprised even himself, some of the tension of the last 4 days easing out of his chest in a way training alone had failed to accomplish. The moment was interrupted by Tobin, arriving at a dead run across the training ground, and the easy warmth of the morning evaporated instantly at the look on the young scout's face. Steward wants everyone in the war room, Tobin gasped out. Now. Choir Command's response just arrived. The walk to the war room felt longer than it should have, the training ground's warmth replaced by a tight, apprehensive silence that spread through the gathered devils as word passed from one to another. By the time Issei reached the war room itself, it was already crowded, Lucien standing at the head of the table with a scroll in hand, his scarred face carefully unreadable in a way that told Issei more than any expression could have. Choir Command has responded to Ariel's report, Lucien said without preamble, once the room had settled into tense, expectant quiet. Their assessment is, in their words, cautious. They have not authorized an immediate large-scale strike against this enclave, citing insufficient confirmed threat to warrant violating standing treaty terms outright. A ripple of relief passed through the room, quickly tempered by the grim set of Lucien's jaw, which made it clear the news was not entirely good. However, he continued, they have authorized what they are calling an observation period. Choir forces will maintain a heightened presence in this region for the next month, monitoring this enclave's activity closely. Any further significant growth in devil strength, any indication that what happened here might spread to other enclaves, will trigger immediate reassessment, and Choir Command has been explicit that a reassessment under those circumstances would very likely result in the large-scale response we avoided today. A month, Kate said slowly. They're giving us a month before deciding whether to actually commit to wiping us out. Essentially, yes, Lucien said. Which means we have a month to decide what we do with that time. continue building strength cautiously, and risk drawing exactly the response we are trying to avoid. Or hold steady, consolidate what we have gained, and hope that caution alone is enough to convince Kuoh Command this enclave does not represent the threat they fear. His gaze settled on Issei. Guardian. This decision affects you more directly than anyone else in this room. What is your counsel? Issei felt the weight of the question settle over him, the same weight he'd felt standing in this room a week ago, except heavier now, informed by everything he'd seen and built and risked in the days since. He thought of Yara's tears, of Petra's disbelieving laughter, of Ariel's serene, dangerous calm and the genuine consideration that had flickered briefly behind it when he challenged her righteousness directly. We don't hold steady, he said finally. Not because I don't understand the risk of continuing to grow. I do. But holding steady means accepting that this enclave stays exactly as strong as it is right now, forever, hoping that's enough to survive whatever comes next. I don't think it is. I think if we stop now, we're just delaying the same slow ending this world has been grinding toward for 300 years, except now we'll have shown Kuoh Command exactly how much stronger devils could become, and given them every reason to make sure it never happens again more thoroughly than before. Then what do you propose instead? Lucien asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. We grow smarter, not just faster, Issei said. We use this month not just to keep bonding and training, but to figure out how to do it in ways that don't show up as obviously on whatever wards or sensors the Kuoh uses to monitor us. We reach out, carefully, to the other 11 enclaves, and see if this is something that can spread beyond just the Obsidian Court, quietly, before Kuoh Command even realizes how far it's already gone. And we prepare, seriously, for the possibility that a month from now, caution wasn't enough, and we need to be ready to actually fight, not just survive an investigation. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of the proposal settling over everyone present, ambitious and dangerous in equal measure. Celine was the first to speak, her voice steady despite the risk inherent in what Issei had just suggested. It is the harder path, she said. But I believe it is the correct one. Caution alone has bought this enclave 300 years of slow decline. If we are ever going to change that trajectory rather than simply delaying its ending, we cannot do it by staying exactly as small and careful as we have always been. Reaching the other enclaves will not be simple, Lucien said, though his tone carried more consideration than outright refusal now. Some have grown as suspicious of outside contact as they have of the hunters themselves. Trust between enclaves is not what it once was, 300 years ago. Then we start slow, Issei said. One enclave. Whichever one you trust most. We show them what's possible here, the same way I showed this enclave. Let the results speak for themselves, the way they did in that training ground last week. Lucien studied him for a long moment, and something in the old steward's expression shifted, settling into a decision that Issei could see cost him considerably, given 300 years of hard-learned caution weighing against it. The Ember Reach Enclave, Lucien said finally. 2 days' flight from here, smaller than us, led by a woman I have trusted since before the failure weakened either of our territories significantly. If any enclave beyond our own might be willing to risk what you are proposing, it is hers. He rolled the scroll closed with a decisive motion. I will send word requesting a meeting. Guardian, Celine, you will accompany me when it is arranged. The rest of this council will continue our preparations here, both strengthening what we have built and ensuring it does not become visible enough, too quickly, to trigger exactly the response we are trying to outmaneuver. The room dissolved once more into purposeful motion, orders given and received, the enormous scope of what Issei had just proposed settling into the practical, grinding work of actually attempting it. Celine fell into step beside him as they left the war room, her expression thoughtful, weighing something. You realize, she said quietly, once they were beyond the immediate crowd, that what you just proposed is not simply a plan to save this enclave anymore. If it works, if the Ember Reach Enclave agrees, if this truly spreads beyond a single training ground, you are describing something considerably larger than that. You are describing the beginning of an actual reversal, after 300 years of only ever losing ground. Yeah, Issei said, feeling the weight and the promise of that realization settle over him in equal measure. I know. Drake figured that out about the same time I did. He is more perceptive than he lets on, being trapped in your arm all day, Celine said, a faint, dry humor coloring her voice despite the gravity of the moment, and Issei felt Drake's low, amused rumble in response, some of the tension of the morning easing, just slightly, into something that felt almost like the beginning of genuine hope, rather than merely the desperate, fragile kind that had carried this enclave through 300 years of slow, grinding survival. One enclave, Issei said, mostly to himself, watching the shimmering wards blaze faintly against the pale morning sky as they walked. Then another, until this world remembers what it actually looks like when devils stop simply surviving, and start standing up again. That is either an extraordinarily ambitious plan, Celine said, or an extraordinarily necessary one. Maybe, Issei said, echoing the words she'd offered him a week ago, in a library full of half-forgotten books and grief. There isn't as much difference between those two things as this world has learned to believe. Celine's answering smile, small and genuine and entirely unguarded, told him she understood exactly what he meant, and together, beneath a sky that held the promise of both danger and possibility in equal, uncertain measure, they set off to begin the long, difficult work of proving it true. Chapter 11. Lucien's message to the Ember Reach Enclave took 2 days to arrange a response, and in that waiting, Issei found himself pulled increasingly into the daily rhythms of a community that had, in the space of little more than a week, begun to feel less like strangers he was obligated to protect and more like people he had genuinely come to care about. He learned Petra loved sketching, filling the margins of borrowed paper with careful, delicate drawings of the ruins beyond the wards, imagined as they might have looked before 300 years of decay, and that she had never shown anyone those drawings until she showed him, shy and hopeful, on the evening of the 5th day. He learned Yara had once been a healer before the losses that hardened her into a fighter, and that her hands, when he watched her tend a training injury without thinking, still carried the gentle, practiced competence of that older calling beneath the calluses she'd built since. He learned Cade's restless energy came from a fear of stillness, of the particular kind of grief that crept in whenever he let himself stop moving long enough to feel the weight of everyone he'd already lost. You're good with them, Celine observed, watching him help a group of Enclave children construct an elaborate, if structurally questionable, fort out of scavenged training equipment on the evening of the 6th day, laughter ringing out across the lower training ground in a way that felt, in this exhausted, careful place, almost startlingly foreign. I like kids, Issei admitted, ducking as one particularly enthusiastic 6-year-old lobbed a foam practice weapon at his head with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Back home, I had a lot of people looking out for me when I probably didn't deserve it. Feels right to pass some of that along. You deserve it, Celine said, quiet and certain, and something in the directness of the statement made Issei glance at her, catching an expression on her face that she smoothed away too quickly for him to fully read. Whatever brought you here, Issei, this enclave is fortunate for it. I want you to understand that clearly, whatever else this month brings. Before Issei could respond, a small hand tugged insistently at his sleeve, and he turned to find the fort's chief architect, a serious-faced 7-year-old named Ren, regarding him with the intense scrutiny of someone about to ask a question of great importance. Are you really going to make it so devils aren't scared anymore? Ren asked. The question landed with more weight than her small, serious face suggested she understood, and Issei crouched down to her level, considering his answer carefully. I'm going to try really hard, he said honestly. I can't promise it'll happen fast, or that it'll be easy. But I promise I'm not going to stop trying. Ren studied him for a long moment with the particular unblinking seriousness children reserve for questions that mattered enormously to them, then nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to directing her fort's ongoing construction with renewed enthusiasm. Celine watched the exchange with an expression that had gone soft in a way Issei hadn't seen from her before, something unguarded and quietly moved. They remember nothing else, she said, once Ren had scampered off. The children born in the last decade, they have never known this enclave as anything but frightened and diminished. If what we are building here means even one generation of devil children grows up without that fear defining every part of their lives, I think that alone would be worth every risk we are taking. It's not just worth it, Issei said, watching Ren's fort collapse spectacularly, followed immediately by delighted, unbothered laughter and the enthusiastic beginning of reconstruction. "It's the whole point." The response from Ember Reach arrived on the morning of the 7th day, carried by a weary courier who had flown through the night to deliver it, and Lucien called the war room together within the hour, the scroll unrolled across the map table with careful, deliberate hands. "Mara Thorne, steward of Ember Reach, has agreed to a meeting," Lucien announced, and something in the room eased at the news, tension giving way to cautious anticipation. "She is, in her own words, intrigued, and considerably more willing to take risks than the more cautious enclaves further south. She has requested we come within the week, before word of what happened here inevitably reaches enclaves less inclined toward trust." "Then we go as soon as we can arrange it," Issei said. "2 days," Lucien said. "It will take that long to prepare properly, and to ensure this enclave remains adequately defended in our absence. Celine, Cade, you will accompany the Guardian and myself. The rest of the Council will maintain operations here, continuing training and bonding cautiously in our absence." The 2 days of preparation passed in a blur of careful planning, Celine poring over what remained of the library's diplomatic texts for any guidance on how such negotiations had once been conducted between Devil territories, Cade drilling relentlessly to ensure he'd be combat-ready for whatever the unfamiliar journey might demand, Lucien conferring with the wider council on contingencies should anything go wrong in their absence. Issei spent the time bonding with 2 more devils, carefully selected fighters who would help hold the enclave's defenses steady, and found himself, in quiet moments between preparations, thinking increasingly of Ren's serious, hopeful question, of the weight of a promise made to a child who had never known devils as anything but frightened. On the morning of their departure, the entire enclave gathered near the outer wards to see them off, a crowd that had, in the space of a single week, transformed from wary, exhausted survivors into something that felt, however cautiously, like a community daring to hope again. Petra pressed a small, careful sketch into Issei's hands before he left, a drawing of the obsidian court not as it currently stood, ruined and diminished, but as she imagined it might look restored, towers rebuilt, plazas full of life once more. "So you remember what we're actually working toward," she said, blushing furiously at her own boldness. "Not just surviving this." Issei looked at the careful, hopeful lines of her drawing, at the imagined future it represented, and felt something settle firmly into place inside his chest, resolve sharpening into something unshakable. "I'll remember," he promised, tucking the sketch carefully away. "I'll bring it back to you finished someday." "I mean that." Celine watched the exchange with an expression that had grown, over the course of the week, increasingly difficult for her to keep fully guarded, something warm and quietly proud settling behind her careful composure as she came to stand beside him, wings flexing in preparation for the 2-day flight ahead. "Ready, Guardian?" she asked. Issei looked back once more at the gathered enclave, at Ren waving enthusiastically from her father's shoulders, at Yara's steady, grateful nod, at the shimmering wards holding strong against the sky that, for the first time in 300 years, carried something other than grim resignation for the devils sheltering beneath it. "Ready," he said, and together with Celine, Cade, and Lucien, rose into the pale morning light, beginning the long flight toward Ember Reach, toward whatever the next enclave's answer might bring, carrying with him the fragile, stubborn, unmistakably real beginning of a hope this broken world had waited 300 years to feel again. Behind them, the obsidian quartz wards blazed steady and bright against the retreating dark, and ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, an entire world that had forgotten what devils were capable of becoming waited, unknowing, for the reminder that was already, unstoppably, on its way. Drake's voice rumbled quietly within Issei's chest as the enclave shrank into the distance below them, 3 moons still faintly visible even against the brightening sky. "1 enclave becomes 2, partner. 2 becomes a dozen, if fortune and effort both hold steady. I have watched empires rise from smaller beginnings than this, across every age I have lived through." A pause waited with something that, from a dragon as old and as guarded as Drake, counted as genuine warmth. "Whatever Mira Thorne decides when we land, know that you have already done something this world's choir, its Talon cells, its every hunter convinced of Devil's permanent weakness, believed was no longer possible. You have made an entire enclave dare to hope again." Let us go make certain that hope was not given in vain. It won't be, Issei said, watching the horizon stretch out ahead of them, vast and uncertain and, for the first time in longer than this world had dared to remember, genuinely full of possibility. Not while I've still got something left to give. The wind carried them onward, 4 devils and 1 dragon bound for a meeting that would decide far more than either enclave yet realized, and somewhere far below, in the quiet dark beneath a sky finally beginning to remember what hope looked like, an entire broken world waited, unknowing, for everything that was still to come. Lucien flew a short distance ahead, scanning the horizon with the sharp, practiced vigilance of a man who had led his people through 300 years of careful survival, and yet even he, Issei noticed, carried himself differently this morning. Some of the old weight in his shoulders eased, if only slightly, by the fragile promise of what lay ahead. Cade flew close beside them, restless energy for once settled into something quieter, more focused, his gaze fixed steadily forward. And Celine, flying at Issei's side, wings catching the pale morning light with a strength that had not existed in her a week ago, glanced over at him with an expression that needed no words to convey exactly what she was thinking. 2 days to Ember Reach. 2 days to discover whether one enclave's stubborn hope could truly become the beginning of something larger. Issei tightened his grip on the small, careful sketch Petra had pressed into his hands, tucked safely away, and set his eyes forward, toward the horizon, toward whatever answer waited for them there. Chapter 12. Ember Reach announced itself long before they reached it, a faint golden shimmer visible against the horizon even from a considerable distance, unlike the deep violet wards of the obsidian court. Issei noted the difference immediately, and Celine, following his gaze, offered an explanation without needing to be asked. Different enclaves developed different ward traditions after the failure, she said, wings beating steadily against the thinning mountain air as they descended toward the distant glow. Ember Reach was founded by devils who fled the collapse of an older territory further east, and they carried different theoretical foundations with them. Their wards run warmer, more golden, because they draw more heavily on fire aspect current than we do. It is not better or worse. Simply different. Does that matter for what we're trying to do? Issei asked. It might, Celine admitted. The bonding theory we tested draws on general current regardless of elemental leaning, but I confess I do not know how a fire aspect current might respond differently than the shadow aspect current we work with at the Obsidian Court. It is one more thing we will need to test carefully, assuming Mirathorn agrees to let us. Lucien, flying just ahead of them, called back over his shoulder. Mira is many things, but cautious about her own people's safety above all else. Do not expect her to agree to anything without seeing proof first, however much she trusts me personally. 300 years has taught every steward on this world the same hard lesson about promises that sound too good to be true. They landed at the edge of Ember Reach's outer wards as the golden light deepened toward evening, and Issei found himself struck immediately by how different this enclave felt from the Obsidian Court, despite sharing the same essential grief and precarious survival. Where the Obsidian Court had been built downward into the bones of a dead volcano, all dark stone and narrow passages, Ember Reach sprawled across a wide, sheltered valley, its buildings low and clustered close together, red clay and warm wood rather than obsidian, terraced gardens climbing the surrounding hillsides in defiance of whatever scarcity had shaped the rest of this world's devil territories. A welcoming party waited at the ward's edge, headed by a woman who could only be Mirathorn, tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped auburn hair and the kind of weathered, capable face that suggested someone who had spent as much time in combat as in council chambers. Her wings, Issei noted immediately, were larger than Celine's had been before their bond, closer to what he understood devil wings should naturally look like, and he filed that observation away with interest. Lucien Ashgrave, Mira said, a warm, genuine smile breaking across her face as she strode forward to clasp the older steward's arm in greeting. You look older every time I see you, and somehow more stubborn to match. You look exactly the same, which either means you have found some secret to defying time, or you simply intimidated into leaving you be, Lucien replied, something in his usually severe expression easing into genuine warmth that Issei hadn't seen from him before. Mira, allow me to introduce the reason for our visit. This is Issei Hyoudou, and beside him, Celine Vass, our enclave's war mage. Cade Marrow, one of our finest young fighters. Myra's sharp gaze settled on Issei with open, assessing curiosity, taking in his unfamiliar clothes, the faint golden shimmer of Drake's dormant power that even untrained eyes seemed to sense radiating from him. So this is the stranger who fell out of the sky and apparently taught an entire enclave to stop being afraid within a week. Lucien's letter was frustratingly light on details. I am hoping you intend to be more forthcoming. I'll tell you everything, Issei said. But I'd rather show you, if you're willing. Words only get you so far with something like this. Something sharp and interested flickered behind Myra's eyes. Bold. I like bold, generally, though I have also buried enough bold young fighters over the years to temper my enthusiasm somewhat. She gestured toward the sprawling valley behind her. Come. We will talk properly over a meal first, and then, if I am satisfied with what I hear, you may show me whatever it is you are proposing. I did not survive 300 years of careful leadership by rushing into unproven miracles, however promising Lucien's letter made them sound. The meal that followed was held in a wide, open pavilion at the heart of Ember Reach, long tables filled with a modest but genuine spread of food, dozens of curious devils gathering at a respectful distance to watch the visitors with open, wary interest. Issei found himself telling the story again, the fall through an impossible sky, the war room conversation with Lucien, the bonding ritual with Celine, the confrontation with Ariel's choir patrol, watching Myra's expression shift gradually from polite skepticism into something more genuinely engaged as the details accumulated. A blood contract, Myra said finally, once he'd finished, turning the words over with the careful consideration of someone weighing enormous risk against enormous potential reward. I have read of them, in what remains of our own library. My grandmother spoke of them once, before the failure stole away the strength that made them commonplace among the old great houses. Her sharp gaze settled on Celine. You have experienced this bond directly. Tell me honestly, war mage. Was it worth the risk? Celine didn't hesitate. Yes, she said simply. Without qualification. I have felt, for the first time in my life, what the old texts describe as a genuine current rather than a trickle. Whatever caution this decision deserves, and it deserves considerable caution, I would make the same choice again without hesitation. Myra studied her for a long moment, then turned back to Issei, something decided settling behind her sharp eyes. Very well. I will not commit my entire enclave to something this significant based on a meal and a persuasive story, however compelling. But I will allow a demonstration, with volunteers, carefully monitored. If what I see convinces me this is genuinely as safe and as powerful as you claim, we will discuss further. If it does not. She let the sentence trail off, the implication clear enough without further elaboration. That's fair, Issei said. That's more than fair, actually. I wouldn't trust it either, if our positions were reversed. Something in that admission seemed to ease a measure of Myra's remaining wariness, and she nodded, decisive. Tomorrow morning, then? I will select the volunteers myself, fighters I trust to give me an honest account of the experience regardless of outcome. She rose from the table, the meal apparently concluded. Rest well tonight, all of you. Tomorrow will decide a great deal, one way or another. As the gathering dispersed, Issei found himself approached by a young devil who had been sitting near the edge of the pavilion throughout the meal, listening with an intensity that stood out even among the generally curious crowd. He was perhaps Issei's own age, lean and quick-eyed, with the restless energy of someone who spent more time observing than speaking. You really believe this can spread, the young man said without preamble, once the immediate crowd had thinned. Not just help one enclave. Actually spread, enclave to enclave, until it matters on a scale big enough to change how this whole world works. I have to believe it, Issei said. Otherwise, what's the point of starting at all? The young man considered that, something calculating behind his quick, watchful eyes. I'm Corin, he said. I run messages between enclaves, when the roads are safe enough to risk it, which isn't often. I've seen more of this world's devil territories than almost anyone still living, because most stewards trust me enough to let me move between them. He paused, weighing something. If what Myra sees tomorrow convinces her, And if this really is what you're claiming it is, I could get word to enclaves further out. One's Lucian's letters would never reach directly. One's desperate enough that they might listen even faster than Ember Reach did. Issei felt something sharpen with interest, Drake stirring attentively within his chest at the possibility being offered. How many enclaves are we talking about? All 12, eventually, if the roads hold and nobody decides I'm more trouble than I'm worth, Corin said, a faint, wry smile touching his mouth. I've delivered worse news than hope, over the years. Word of enclaves falling. Word of hunting parties on the move. It would be nice, for once, to be the one carrying something worth actually looking forward to. Then let's make sure tomorrow gives you exactly that to carry, Issei said, and something in Corin's expression shifted, decided, the beginning of an alliance forming in the quiet dusk of a valley enclave that, 12 hours from now, might become the second thread in a rope Issei was determined to weave strong enough to hold an entire world's worth of desperate, dwindling hope. Chapter 13. Myra's chosen volunteers gathered at dawn in a wide, sunlit courtyard at the heart of Ember Reach, 5 fighters selected with obvious care, each carrying the particular weathered steadiness of devils who had survived enough combat to be trusted with their steward's honest assessment of whatever came next. Myra herself stood among them, arms crossed, watching with the sharp, unblinking focus of someone determined to miss nothing. You said this would work regardless of elemental aspect, she said to Celine, as Issei prepared for the first bonding. I want to understand why, before we proceed. My people's current runs fire aspect. Yours runs shadow. If this fails because of some incompatibility either of us anticipated, I want to at least understand what went wrong. The theory suggests the bond draws on the underlying current itself, rather than its elemental expression, Celine explained, drawing out the same worn volume she'd carried from the Obsidian Quartz library. Elemental aspect shapes how that current manifests outwardly, in wings, in combat style, in the particular flavor of magic each bloodline favors. But the current beneath it, the raw magical wellspring the old texts call the deep current, exists independent of that expression. If the theory holds, Issei's connection should strengthen the underlying current regardless of how your people's bloodline chooses to express it. Should, Mira repeated, something dry in her tone. I notice you are careful with your certainty, War Mage. I have learned to be, Celine said unbothered. Certainty that outpaces actual evidence has cost devils more than caution ever has, in my experience. I would rather tell you honestly what I believe than promise you something I cannot yet guarantee. Something in that answer seemed to settle whatever remaining reservations Mira carried, and she nodded, gesturing toward the first volunteer, a broad-shouldered fighter named Dax with scars along one forearm that spoke of some old, hard-fought battle. Begin, then? Carefully. The bonding proceeded much as it had at the Obsidian Court, though Issei found himself paying closer attention this time to the subtle differences Celine had warned him might emerge. Dax's wings, when the connection settled, darkened and strengthened as Cade's and Petra's had, but the light that flickered around them carried a warmer, amber tint rather than the golden shimmer Issei had grown accustomed to, and Dax himself let out a startled, wondering laugh as he flexed newly capable muscles. I feel like I could fly straight to the sun, he said, turning to Mira with open astonishment. Steward, this is real. Whatever this is, it's real. Myra's careful composure cracked, just slightly, something hopeful and hard-won breaking through as she watched Dax test the limits of his strength and form. Continue, she said, voice steadier than her expression. All 5, if he can manage it. Issei could manage it, though by the time the 5th bond settled into place, exhaustion had begun dragging heavily at his limbs, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cool morning air. Celine watched him with visible concern, her hand finding his shoulder in a steadying gesture as the last volunteer, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman named Ilsa, examined her newly transformed wings with quiet, overwhelmed wonder. That is enough for today, Celine said firmly, echoing Drake's own insistent warning rumbling within Issei's chest. You have proven what needed proving. Do not overextend further to satisfy anyone's remaining curiosity. Mira, watching the exchange, nodded slowly, something settled and decided in her expression now. Agreed. I have seen enough. She turned to address the small crowd that had gathered to watch, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard. 5 of our own, strengthened beyond anything this enclave has produced in 3 centuries, in the span of a single morning. I do not need further proof of what this offers. Her gaze shifted to Issei, something like genuine respect settling behind her sharp eyes. Guardian. I am prepared to discuss what a formal alliance between Emberreach and the Obsidian Court might look like, built around what you have shown us here today. But I want to be direct about the cost as well as the benefit, because I suspect you already understand it, and I would rather we face it honestly together than pretend it does not exist. The choir's observation period, Issei said. If this spreads to a second enclave, that's exactly the kind of growth they warned would trigger a larger response. Precisely, Mira said. Which means the moment Emberreach commits to this alongside the Obsidian Court, we are both wagering everything on the belief that spreading strength faster than the choir can react is possible, when 300 years of history suggests the opposite has always been true. I do not make that wager lightly. But I have watched my own people grow thinner and more exhausted every year for 3 decades of leadership, and I am tired, Guardian, in a way that goes beyond simple fatigue, of watching us slowly disappear one careful, cautious decade at a time. Her jaw set, something fierce and resolved settling into her weathered features. I would rather risk everything on a chance at actually changing our trajectory than continue managing our decline with dignity until there is nothing left of us to manage at all. Then we do this together, Issei said. Carefully, like we discussed. Quiet growth where we can manage it, and preparation for the alternative if quiet isn't enough to keep us under the choir's notice. Mira extended her hand, and Issei clasped it, the formal gesture settling into place with a weight that felt, in that sunlit courtyard, considerably larger than the simple handshake it appeared to be from the outside. Then Emberreach stands with the Obsidian Court, Mira said, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear clearly, and something in the courtyard shifted at the declaration, murmurs of astonishment and hope rippling outward through the assembled devils in a wave that Issei suspected, watching Corin's sharp, satisfied smile from the edge of the crowd, would carry considerably further than this single valley by the time the sun set again. Lucian, watching the exchange with visible relief easing the tension from his scarred features, stepped forward to clasp Myra's arm once more. 2 enclaves is a considerably stronger beginning than 1, old friend. I confess I did not expect you to commit this quickly, even knowing your usual willingness to gamble when the cause justifies it. I did not commit quickly, Mira corrected, a wry, tired smile touching her mouth. I committed after 300 years of watching for exactly this kind of opportunity, and refusing to let caution cost us the chance when it finally arrived. There is a difference, Lucian, between recklessness and recognizing when the wager has finally shifted in your favor. Corin approached as the crowd began to disperse, excited murmurs still rippling through the gathered devils, his expression carrying the same sharp, calculating satisfaction Issei had noted the evening before. I'll leave within the hour, he said quietly, for Issei's ears alone. There are 3 enclaves within reasonable flying distance that might listen, if I carry word of this alongside Myra's endorsement. Desperate enough to take the risk, cautious enough not to do anything foolish with the information in the meantime. I'll start there. Be careful, Issei said. If word of this spreads too fast, too visibly, that's exactly what draws the choir's larger response. I have spent years learning how to move quietly between enclaves that would rather nobody know they still exist at all, Corin said, something confident and capable settling into his usual restless energy. Careful is my specialty, Guardian. Leave the quiet spreading to me. You focus on making sure what you're offering is worth spreading in the first place. As Corin departed within the hour, exactly as promised, Issei stood at the edge of Emberreach's golden wards, watching the young messenger's small, quick form disappear toward the horizon, and felt Drake's presence settle into something thoughtful and cautiously optimistic within his chest. 2 enclaves, partner, the dragon murmured. And already the beginning of a 3rd, 4th, perhaps 5th conversation being carried outward by a young man who has spent years learning exactly how to move unseen through a world built to hunt devils to extinction. I confess, this is moving faster than even my optimism anticipated. Good, Issei said quietly, watching the last trace of Corin's flight vanish against the pale morning sky. Faster is exactly what we need, if we're going to outrun whatever the choir decides to do once that observation period runs out. Celine came to stand beside him, her own gaze following the same empty horizon. Something quietly proud and determined settled into her expression now that hadn't been there a week ago, in a library full of old, half-forgotten grief. One enclave becomes two, she said, echoing the words he'd offered her before their departure. You were right to believe it possible, guardian. I confess I did not fully share your certainty, even after everything we built at the Obsidian Court. I am glad to have been wrong. You weren't wrong, Issei said. You were careful. There's a difference, remember? Mira just taught me that one too. Celine's answering smile, warm and genuine and entirely unguarded, told him she understood exactly what he meant, and together, beneath the golden light of Ember Reach's strengthened wards, they turned back toward the Valley Enclave's heart, toward the considerable work still remaining before this fragile, spreading hope could become something strong enough to withstand whatever this broken world's oldest, most patient hunters decided to send against it next. Chapter 14. The return flight to the Obsidian Court carried a different weight than the journey out had, the uncertain hope of a proposal not yet tested replaced by the harder, more grounded satisfaction of an alliance actually forged. Issei found himself watching Lucien throughout the 2-day flight, noting the way the old steward's usual careful composure had eased into something that looked, for the first time since Issei had met him, almost like genuine optimism. You and Mira go back a long way, Issei said during a rest stop on a windswept ridge midway through their journey, the 3 moons already beginning to rise despite the sun not yet having fully set, the sky's usual layered strangeness settling over them once more. Further than either of us likes to admit, some days, Lucien said, a faint, tired smile touching his scarred face. We trained together, before the failure. I was barely more than a boy, full of the same certainty about devil strength that you carry now, before I watched 300 years grind that certainty down into whatever caution you have seen me carrying since. He studied Issei for a long moment. You remind me somewhat of who I was, before all of it. I had forgotten, I think, how that particular kind of certainty felt from the inside, until you fell out of that impossible sky and reminded this entire enclave what daring to hope for something better actually looked like. I'm sorry you had to forget it in the first place, Issei said quietly. Do not be, Lucien said. The forgetting kept my people alive long enough for you to arrive and remind us it was worth remembering again. There is no shame in the caution that survival demanded, even if I am grateful, more than I can easily express, that circumstances have finally allowed room for something more than caution alone. He rose, wings flexing in preparation to continue their flight. Come. 2 enclaves stand together now. Let us make certain the 3rd day of the choir's month-long observation finds us prepared for whatever comes next, rather than simply hopeful. They arrived back at the Obsidian Court on the evening of the 9th day since Ariel's initial visit, and Issei felt the familiar warmth of homecoming settle over him as the enclave's violet wards came into view, deepening quickly into something more complicated when he registered the tension visible even from a distance. Devils gathered in tight, anxious clusters near the outer gate rather than the relaxed activity he'd expected to find. Something's wrong, Cade said, tension sharpening his voice as they descended. They landed to find the war room already gathered, the council's faces carrying a grim, urgent weight that told Issei the news, whatever it was, had not improved in their absence. A devil he didn't recognize, young and travel-worn, stood near the map table, clearly having only just arrived himself. Guardian, the young devil said, straightening as Issei entered. I am Ren, scout for the Silverleaf Enclave, 3 days' flight east of here. I bring urgent word from my steward. He hesitated, something apprehensive crossing his exhausted features. Word has already reached us of what happened here. Not through Corin's careful channels, but through less careful ones. A Talon cell operating near our territory intercepted a choir communication 3 days past, discussing this enclave's unusual activity in considerably less measured terms than Ariel's original report suggested. The room went tense and quiet, Lucien's jaw tightening as he absorbed the implication. Say plainly what you mean, Scout. The Talon cell believes this enclave represents a growing threat worth eliminating before it spreads further, regardless of what choir command's official observation period technically permits, Ren said. They do not answer to the same restraint the choir operates under. My steward believes, and I agree, that they may move against you directly, without waiting for official sanction, precisely because unofficial action carries less consequence if it succeeds quietly enough. How long do we have? Issei asked, feeling the fragile, hard-won hope of the last 9 days sharpened suddenly into something more urgent and dangerous. Days, perhaps less, Ren said. Talon cells move fast and strike without warning by design. My steward sent me the moment we intercepted word, but I do not know how much of a lead that actually gives you. Lucien's expression had settled into the same grim, focused calculation Issei remembered from the war room 9 days ago, when a choir patrol's arrival had first been announced. Then we prepare for a fight considerably less restrained than the one Ariel offered us. He turned to Issei. Guardian. How many bonds have we managed since your departure? 6 more, Celine said, checking the careful notes she'd left with the council before their journey. 16 total now, including the 10 from before we left. The current has strengthened noticeably across the entire enclave, even among those not directly bonded. I can feel it in the ambient magic the moment I set foot back inside our wards. 16 bonded fighters, and an enclave's worth of strengthened general current, Lucien said, weighing the numbers with the same careful precision he brought to every decision. Against the Talon cell, moving without official restraint, potentially arriving within days. His scarred jaw set with grim resolve. It is more than we had 9 days ago. It will have to be enough, because we do not have time to build further before whatever is coming arrives. Cade, standing near the map table with his arms crossed, spoke up, something fierce and ready in his voice despite the grim news. Then we make sure it's enough. We've been training for exactly this since the moment Issei fell out of that sky. Let them come. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled council, fierce and determined despite the danger, and Issei felt something steady settle into his own chest alongside the familiar rush of urgency, Drake's ancient presence sharpening into focused readiness within him. Ren, Issei said, turning to the exhausted young scout. Thank you for bringing this to us. Is there anything else your steward wanted us to know? Only this, Ren said. My steward said to tell you that Silverleaf is watching closely, and that if the Obsidian Court survives what comes next, we may be willing to discuss what Ember Reach has already agreed to. Desperate as we are, we would rather see proof of survival first, given what may be about to unfold here. A faint, weary smile touched his exhausted face. No offense intended, Guardian. Only caution, born of considerable hard experience. None taken, Issei said. I'd want the same proof, in your position. As Ren was shown to quarters to rest before his return journey, the war room dissolved into urgent, focused preparation, Lucien issuing orders with the same efficient authority Issei remembered from that first morning 9 days ago, though the mood now carried a harder, more determined edge than the cautious uncertainty of that earlier crisis. Issei found himself swept immediately into strategy discussions, into hurried plans for defensive positioning, into the grim, practical work of preparing an entire enclave for a fight that might arrive with little to no warning. Late that night, exhausted from the long flight and the immediate scramble of preparation that had followed it, Issei finally found a quiet moment on the familiar balcony overlooking the enclave's shimmering wards, Celine joining him after a similarly long stretch of urgent work. 9 days, she said quietly, watching the violet light ripple against the darkening sky. 9 days ago, you fell out of an impossible sky, and I did not yet know whether to trust you at all. Now an entire enclave stands ready to fight for something we would not have dared hope for 2 weeks past, and a second enclave has already staked its own survival alongside ours. She glanced at him, something searching in her expression. Does it frighten you, how quickly everything has changed? A little, Issei admitted, echoing the honesty he'd offered her 9 days earlier, in this same spot, beneath these same 3 moons. But I think I'd be more frightened if nothing had changed at all. If we'd stayed cautious and small and let 300 years of grinding decline just keep grinding, without ever trying to actually change it. He looked out at the shimmering wards, at the enclave settling into its own tense, determined preparation beyond them. Whatever's coming, we're facing it stronger than we would have been if we'd never tried. That has to count for something. It counts for a great deal, Celine said, quiet and certain. Whatever happens next, Issei, know that this enclave will face it as something considerably more than the frightened, diminished people we were 2 weeks ago. You have already given us that, regardless of how the coming days unfold. Drake's voice rumbled low and steady within Issei's chest, ancient and unshakable despite the uncertain danger gathering somewhere beyond the horizon. She speaks truly, partner. And I would add only this. Whatever Talon Cell believes it is hunting, moving without restraint against the target it still assumes to be weak and desperate, it has badly misjudged what it is about to find waiting for it here. A pause waited with something that, from a dragon 3,000 years removed from easy sentiment, carried real and considerable warning. Let them come. We are ready. We're ready, Issei echoed quietly, watching the wards blaze steady and defiant against the gathering dark, and beside him, Celine's hand found his, steady and warm, as together they watched the horizon for whatever the coming days would bring. Chapter 15. The Talon Cell struck on the third night, and they struck without the courtesy of announcement, or negotiation that Ariel's choir patrol had extended. Issei woke to the sound of alarm bells, distant and urgent, and was on his feet and moving before he'd fully processed what had woken him, Drake already sharp and alert within his chest, the newly formed bonds humming with sudden tension as 16 devils across the enclave startled awake to the same warning. He met Celine in the corridor outside his chamber, already dressed, a look of grim readiness settling over her features. Outer wards, she said, falling into step beside him as they ran toward the gathering point. Third layer breached already. They're moving fast, and they're not being subtle about it. They emerged onto the enclave's main defensive position to chaos already sharpening into order, Lucian directing fighters into formation with the same efficient authority he'd shown 9 days ago, Cade rallying a group of bonded fighters near the front line, the violet wards flickering and straining under an assault Issei could see even from a distance, dark shapes cutting through the night sky. Wings edged with the particular corrupted darkness that marked fallen angels rather than the pale, serene light of the choir. Fourth layers holding, barely, Lucian reported as Issei reached him, his scarred face tight with focused calculation. They've committed more force than a standard Talon Cell typically carries. I count at least 15 fallen, possibly more still holding back. 15 against 16 bonded fighters and an enclave's worth of strengthened current, Issei said, feeling the weight of the coming fight settle into sharp, familiar focus. That's not impossible odds. It is not, Lucian agreed. But Talon Cells do not commit this much force to a target they consider merely troublesome. They believe they are ending something before it grows dangerous enough to matter. We should assume they intend to fight until one side is no longer capable of continuing. The fourth ward layer failed moments later, a violent flare of light and sound as the barrier gave way, and the Talon Cell descended in a coordinated rush that Issei met head-on, boosted gear flaring to sudden, brilliant life along his forearm as Drake's power surged forward in answer to the threat. Boost! The familiar surge of doubled strength flooded through him, and Issei drove into the first wave of attackers with a speed and force that visibly startled the fallen angels expecting to find easy prey waiting behind failing devil wards. He caught the first attacker's blade on his gauntlet forearm, the impact ringing out sharp and solid, and answered with a strike that sent the fallen angel tumbling backward through the air, momentum lost, wings scrambling for balance. Around him, the bonded fighters met the assault with a ferocity and coordination that spoke to 9 days of intense preparation, Cade cutting through the chaos with restless, fierce energy, Yara's steady, disciplined strikes finding gaps in enemy formation with the calm precision of someone who had spent a decade honing grief into purpose. Petra's newly capable wings carrying her through aerial maneuvers that would have been impossible for her 3 weeks earlier. The Talon Cell, clearly expecting the same diminished, desperate resistance every previous Devil Enclave had offered across 3 centuries of hunting, found instead a defense sharp and coordinated enough to genuinely stagger their advance. Boost! Issei's strength doubled again, and he pressed forward through the chaos toward the fallen angel who appeared to be directing the assault, a tall, severe figure with wings the color of old blood, watching the unexpected resistance with an expression that had shifted from confident anticipation into something considerably more calculating. You, the fallen angel called out, voice carrying easily over the clash of combat, are the stranger the reports spoke of. I confess, I expected considerably less resistance than this. Sorry to disappoint, Issei said, meeting the fallen angel's gaze without flinching, Drake's power humming steady and ready along his arm. You should have listened more carefully to those reports. I listened carefully enough, the fallen angel said. Which is precisely why I am here, rather than waiting for Kuoh Command's cautious observation period to run its slow, deliberate course. Whatever you are building, stranger, it ends tonight, before it grows into something considerably harder to unmake. He struck without further warning, faster than Issei had expected, dark energy crackling along a blade that seemed to drink in the surrounding light, and Issei met the strike with a defense that strained even his boosted strength, the impact reverberating up through his arm with bruising force. Drake, Issei murmured, feeling the fight's intensity sharpen around him. This one's serious. I noticed, partner, Drake said, something focused and unshakably calm in his ancient voice despite the danger. But you have faced considerably worse than a single frustrated fallen angel, however skilled. Boost again, and finish this before he can bring the rest of his cell to bear against you directly. Boost! The third boost flooded through him, and Issei felt the familiar, exhilarating clarity that came with pushing toward his genuine limits settle over the chaos of the fight, the fallen angel's next strike meeting a defense that no longer strained but held solid and immovable. Issei answered with a counter that drove the fallen commander backward, off balance, and pressed the advantage with the relentless, focused intensity of someone who had trained under monsters and gods and understood, with hard-won clarity, exactly how to close out a fight before an opponent could recover their footing. The fallen commander broke first, disengaging with a sharp, frustrated snarl, wings beating hard to put distance between them. This is not finished, he called out, already retreating, gathering the scattered remnants of his cell with urgent, barked commands. You have bought yourselves nothing tonight but a temporary reprieve, stranger. Kuoh Command will hear of this regardless of how carefully your enclave believes it can hide its growth. Then let them hear it, Issei called back, watching the Talon cell's remaining fighters disengage and scatter into the night sky, driven back by a defense they had clearly not anticipated encountering. Tell them exactly what you saw here tonight. The fallen angels retreated fully within minutes, the sound of combat fading into the tense, exhausted quiet of an enclave that had, against considerable odds, held its ground. Issei stood amid the aftermath, breathing hard, the boosted gear's light fading slowly from his forearm, and felt the full weight of the fight's intensity finally catch up with him as adrenaline began to ebb. Issei. Celine reached him first, checking him over with quick, urgent hands before satisfying herself that his injuries, while numerous, were nothing serious. Around them, the Enclave's fighters were doing the same for each other, checking wounds, confirming survivors, the tense silence of the immediate aftermath gradually giving way to the first, disbelieving murmurs of realization that they had actually held. We held, Kate said, appearing beside them with a shallow cut along one cheek and an expression of stunned, exhausted triumph. We actually held them off. 15 fallen angels, and we held. Casualties? Lucian asked, arriving with the same grim, focused efficiency he'd carried throughout the fight, though something in his scarred face had eased, just slightly, at the confirmation of their survival. Wounded, several seriously, Yara reported, already moving among the fighters with the practiced competence of her old healer's training reasserting itself despite the years she'd spent burying that calling beneath a fighter's calluses. But no dead, steward. Not one. For the first time in longer than I can remember, an enclave has faced a serious assault and lost no one. The word settled over the gathered fighters with a weight that Issei could see registering deeply, disbelief and grief and hard-won relief mixing together across dozens of exhausted, battle-worn faces. Lucian closed his eyes for a long moment, something profound and quietly overwhelmed moving behind his usually composed features, before he opened them again, steadying himself with visible effort. Then we have won something tonight considerably larger than simply repelling an attack, he said, voice carrying clearly across the gathered enclave. We have proven, in the clearest terms this world understands, that what we have built here is not fragile. It is not a temporary illusion of strength that shatters at the first real test. His scarred jaw set with fierce, hard-won resolve. Let word of tonight travel exactly as far and as fast as our enemies intend it to. Let choir command, and every Talon cell, and every hunter who has spent 300 years believing devils could never again be anything but prey, hear precisely what happened here tonight, and understand that the ground beneath their certainty has just begun, unmistakably, to shift. A ragged, exhausted cheer rose from the gathered fighters, relief and triumph and disbelief all tangled together, and Issei, standing amid the aftermath of the Enclave's first real, unrestrained battle and longer than most of them could remember, felt Drake's presence settle into something deep and quietly satisfied within his chest. Well fought, partner, the dragon said. Whatever comes next, this world's oldest hunters have just learned something they will not soon forget. Devils are no longer merely prey. And I suspect, before this is over, they are going to regret ever forgetting what we can become when given the chance to remember. Chapter 16. The days following the Talon cell's failed attack brought a strange, disorienting mixture of relief and renewed urgency, the Enclave tending to its wounded even as word of the battle's outcome began, exactly as Lucien had predicted, to travel considerably farther and faster than anyone had fully anticipated. Ren departed for Silverleaf on the morning after the attack, carrying an account of the battle that Issei suspected would lose nothing in the retelling, and returned less than a week later with news that made even Lucien's careful composure crack into something like astonishment. Silverleaf has agreed to send envoys, Ren reported, standing once more in the war room, though this time his exhaustion carried an entirely different quality than the grim urgency of his first visit. Not just to discuss the bonding, though they want that too. My steward wants to discuss something larger. A formal council, guardian, between every enclave willing to attend, to coordinate what comes next now that choir command and the Talon cells both know what happened here. How many enclaves are we talking about? Issei asked, feeling something both hopeful and daunting settle over the question. 5 have responded to Corrin's outreach so far, beyond Ember Reach and Silverleaf, Ren said. 2 more are considering it carefully. Only 3 have declined outright, and even they did not close the door entirely, simply expressed considerable caution about committing before seeing more proof that this survives beyond a single dramatic battle. He offered a tired, genuine smile. Word of what happened here has traveled faster than anything I have carried in years, Guardian. Faster, I think, than even Corrin anticipated when he first set out from Ember Reach. The news settled over the war room with a weight that Issei could see registering deeply among the gathered council, the scope of what had begun as a single desperate gamble now clearly expanding into something considerably larger and more consequential than any of them had fully dared to imagine even a week earlier. A council, Lucien said slowly, testing the word's implications with obvious care. 12 enclaves, or some meaningful fraction of them, gathering openly to coordinate a unified response, for the first time since before the failure weakened us all. That is not simply expanding what we have built here. That is something considerably closer to devils remembering how to act as something larger than isolated, desperate survivors. Is that dangerous? Kate asked, though something fierce and eager beneath the question suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't deter him regardless. Enormously, Celine said, though her own tone carried more anticipation than caution. A gathering that size will be impossible to hide from choir command's attention, or from whatever remains of the Talon cells still operating in this region. If they decide to strike at such a council directly, the consequences could be catastrophic beyond anything we have yet faced. She glanced at Issei, something searching and deliberate in her expression. But I confess, having watched what this enclave built in a matter of weeks, having watched 16 bonded fighters hold off 15 fallen angels without losing a single life, I am inclined to believe the danger of gathering openly is considerably smaller than the danger of continuing to face this fight scattered and isolated, the way devils have faced it for 300 years. Issei considered the weight of the decision seriously, feeling Drake's thoughtful presence settle alongside his own deliberation. He thought of Ren's serious, hopeful question, of Petra's careful sketch of a restored obsidian court tucked safely away in his belongings, of the fierce, disbelieving relief on the faces of 16 bonded fighters who had just proven, against 300 years of grim precedent, that devils could hold their ground and win. We do it, he said finally. Carefully, with as much protection as we can manage, but we do it. If this is going to become something bigger than one enclave's desperate gamble, it has to start becoming that eventually. Might as well be now, while we've got momentum on our side instead of waiting until the choir has time to plan something we can't outmaneuver. Lucien studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, decision settling into place with the same grave weight it had carried 9 days ago when he'd first asked the stranger fallen from an impossible sky what he was willing to give this enclave. Then we begin preparing, he said. A council of this scale will require careful coordination, secure location, and defenses considerably beyond what any single enclave could manage alone. Celine Cade, I want you working with Ren and Corin to establish exactly how such a gathering might be arranged safely. Guardian, continue your training and bonding here, but be ready. If this council convenes, I suspect every enclave attending will want to see, directly, exactly what has made the Obsidian Court's transformation possible. The preparations that followed consumed the better part of another 2 weeks, messages flowing between enclaves with increasing frequency as Corin's careful network expanded, cautious agreements gradually solidifying into an actual plan, a neutral gathering point selected deep within contested territory that no single enclave controlled outright, defensible enough to protect against opportunistic attack, remote enough to avoid easy detection by choir patrols still maintaining their careful, watchful observation. Issei spent the intervening time exactly as Lucien had instructed, continuing his own training under Cade's relentless guidance, bonding carefully with additional fighters as the Enclave's confidence and readiness continued to grow, and increasingly, in quiet moments between the grinding work of preparation, finding himself drawn into conversations with Celine that stretched later into the night than either of them probably should have allowed, given the demands of the coming days. You never talk about your world, she observed, one such evening, the two of them seated on the familiar balcony overlooking wards that had grown, in the weeks since his arrival, considerably brighter and more assured than the exhausted shimmer he'd first witnessed there. Not beyond the broad strokes you offered Ariel, or the examples you gave Mira. What was it actually like, living somewhere devils were never hunted at all? Issei considered the question, memory surfacing unbidden, warm and distant, and strange to reach for across whatever impossible distance now separated him from it. Loud, he said finally, a faint smile touching his mouth. Chaotic, most of the time. Rias, the devil I mentioned, she ran her peerage like a family as much as a fighting force. There was always someone arguing about something, or training too hard, or getting into trouble that required considerable cleanup afterward. He paused, something bittersweet settling into the memory. I miss it. Not in a way that makes me regret being here, exactly. Just in the way you miss anything that mattered to you. Once you understand you might not get back to it. Do you think you will? Celine asked quietly. Get back, I mean. Eventually. I don't know, Issei admitted honestly. I haven't let myself think about it too much, honestly. There's too much happening here that actually needs doing. He glanced over at her, something warm and genuine settling into the admission that followed. And it's not like I've been sitting around missing home without finding things here worth caring about too. This enclave. You. It's not the same as what I left, but it's not nothing either. Celine held his gaze for a long moment, something unguarded and quietly moved crossing her usually composed features, before she looked away, out toward the shimmering wards, a small, genuine smile touching her mouth despite the deflection. That is either a very kind thing to say, she said, echoing words she'd offered him weeks earlier, or a very honest one. I find, increasingly, that I no longer see much difference between those two things, where you are concerned. Good, Issei said. Because I meant every word of it. They sat together in comfortable, companionable silence as the 3 moons rose fully into the deepening sky, the Enclave's violet wards blazing steady and bright behind them, and somewhere beyond the horizon, in territories still deciding whether to trust the fragile, spreading hope that had begun with a single stranger falling out of an impossible sky, an entire broken world continued its slow, uncertain turn toward a council that would, in the weeks to come, decide far more than any of them. Yet fully understood, 3 enclaves stood ready. 5 more considered. And choir command, watching from whatever careful distance their observation period demanded, waited to see exactly how far this stubborn, spreading hope intended to reach before they decided, finally, that caution alone was no longer sufficient to contain it. Issei intended to make certain, whatever that decision eventually became, that it arrived too late to matter. Chapter 17. The council gathering point, when Issei finally saw it 3 weeks later, turned out to be a wide, ancient amphitheater carved into a mountainside deep within contested territory, older even than the obsidian court's own ruins, weathered stone worn smooth by centuries of wind and time. Korin had explained, during the careful, roundabout journey required to reach it undetected, that the site had once served as neutral ground for devil councils before the failure, a place old enough and significant enough that even the fiercest rival houses had once agreed to set aside their conflicts within its bounds. Fitting, in a way, Celine observed, as their small group descended toward the amphitheater's weathered floor, wings catching the pale morning light. We are attempting to rebuild something that existed once before, in a place that remembers what devils were capable of when they chose unity over isolated survival. The gathering, when they arrived, already carried a weight and scale that made the enormity of what Issei had set in motion suddenly, vividly concrete. Delegations from 7 enclaves had assembled by the time Lucien's group arrived, stewards and their chosen representatives clustered in wary, curious groups across the ancient amphitheater floor, the air thick with the tension that mixed cautious hope with the hard, practiced wariness of people who had survived 300 years by trusting almost nothing offered freely. Marathorn greeted them first, striding across the weathered stone with the same warm, capable confidence Issei remembered from Ember Reach. 7 enclaves, she said without preamble, falling into step beside Lucien. More than even Korin's optimistic estimates suggested might actually commit to showing up in person. Whatever you started with that boy of yours, old friend, it has clearly traveled further and faster than any of us anticipated. He is not mine to claim credit for, Lucien said, though something in his tone carried unmistakable pride nonetheless. But I will agree the momentum has exceeded my own expectations considerably. The council convened within the hour, stewards and representatives arranging themselves across the amphitheater's ancient tiered seating while Issei stood near the center, acutely aware of dozens of assessing, curious, wary gazes settling on him from every enclave present. Ren's steward from Silverleaf, a severe, silver-haired woman named Thessaly, spoke first, her voice carrying the particular sharp skepticism of someone who had traveled considerable distance still deciding whether the risk had been worthwhile. We have all heard the accounts, she said, addressing the gathered council directly. A stranger falling from an impossible sky. A bonding ritual unused in 3 centuries, suddenly restored. A Talon cell repelled without a single devil life lost, for the first time in longer than any enclave present can properly remember. Her sharp gaze settled on Issei. I have traveled considerable distance to see this proven directly, rather than simply relayed through increasingly embellished retellings. Will you show us, stranger, exactly what you have shown Ember Reach and the Obsidian Court both? That's why I'm here, Issei said, meeting her gaze steadily. I'd rather you see it yourselves than take anyone's word for it, mine included. What followed occupied the better part of the day, careful, deliberate demonstrations conducted under the watchful, assessing eyes of 7 stewards and their gathered representatives, Celine explaining the underlying theory with the same measured precision she'd offered Mira weeks earlier, Issei bonding with volunteers from 3 different enclaves in succession, each demonstration met with the same startled, disbelieving wonder that had marked every previous showing, gradually shifting the room's cautious skepticism into something considerably more engaged. By evening, as the 3 moons began their familiar ascent over the ancient amphitheater, Thessaly approached Issei directly, her earlier sharp skepticism tempered now into something more thoughtful. I confess, she said, I arrived here prepared to find some clever trick, some limited demonstration that would not survive genuine scrutiny. I did not expect to watch 3 separate enclaves representatives leave that bonding circle carrying strength this world has not seen in 3 centuries. She studied him a moment longer. Silverleaf will commit. Cautiously, and with considerable preparation, but we will commit. I suspect, watching the reactions around this amphitheater tonight, we will not be the only enclave reaching that conclusion before this council concludes. She proved correct. Over the following 2 days, as the council continued its careful deliberations, 5 of the 7 attending enclaves formally committed to the growing alliance, each steward returning to their own territory with plans to begin bonding and training their own fighters using the theory Celine had spent the last month refining into something considerably more precise and reliable than the uncertain experiment it had begun as. The remaining 2 enclaves withheld formal commitment but agreed to continued dialogue, their caution tempered by genuine, visible interest rather than outright dismissal. On the council's final evening, Lucien called the assembled stewards together one last time, the ancient amphitheater's weathered stone catching the combined light of 3 moons and a dozen small fires scattered across its tiers. 300 years ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered representatives, devils on this world lost more than simple magical strength. We lost the ability to act as anything larger than isolated, desperate survivors, each enclave clinging to its own narrow margin of continued existence, watching the others fall one by one without daring to risk what little we had left to help. He paused, gaze sweeping across the assembled faces, Myra's steady confidence, Thessaly's thoughtful resolve, the cautious hope visible even among representatives from enclaves still withholding full commitment. Tonight, for the first time since that failure, we have remembered something we should never have forgotten. That devils were never meant to face this world's cruelty alone. That whatever this stranger has offered us, the true strength it represents is not merely magical. It is the reminder that unity, however dangerous, however costly, has always been the thing our enemies fear most. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered council, fierce and determined despite the considerable danger still gathering somewhere beyond the amphitheater's ancient walls, and Issei, standing near the center of a gathering that had begun as a single desperate gamble and grown, in the space of a single month, into something considerably larger and more consequential than he had dared imagine possible, felt Drake's presence settle into something deep and quietly resolute within his chest. 5 enclaves, partner, the dragon murmured, with 2 more watching closely enough to likely follow before long. This world's choir command believed a month's cautious observation would be sufficient to judge whatever threat you represented. I suspect, watching what has unfolded across these last weeks, they have badly underestimated exactly how much can change when devils remember what they are capable of becoming, given even the smallest genuine chance. Then let's make sure they keep underestimating us for exactly as long as it takes to matter, Issei murmured back, watching the assembled stewards begin the practical, urgent work of coordinating what came next, 5 enclaves worth of hard-won hopes settling into place around him like the first genuine foundation this broken world's devils had built in 300 years. Around the amphitheater, the practical business of alliance continued late into the night, delegations exchanging contact protocols, agreeing on secure channels through which Corin's careful network could relay urgent word between territories now bound together by something considerably stronger than mere goodwill. Thessaly worked alongside Celine, comparing notes on Silverleaf's own diminished current against the theory that had already reshaped 2 other enclaves' fortunes, her earlier sharp skepticism now given over entirely to focused, engaged collaboration. Mira and Lucien conferred quietly near the amphitheater's edge, old friends turned unlikely architects of something neither had dared imagine possible even 2 months prior. Celine found him as the gathering finally began to disperse toward well-earned rest, her expression carrying the same quiet, determined warmth that had grown steadily more visible across the weeks since his arrival. 5 enclaves, she said softly, echoing his own private accounting. 1 month ago, I would not have believed this possible, however desperately I might have wished for it. We're not done, Issei said, watching the ancient amphitheater slowly empty around them, the weight of everything still ahead settling alongside the hard-won satisfaction of everything already accomplished. Choir Command's observation period is almost up. Whatever happens next, it's going to test everything we've built here a lot harder than one Talon cell did. I know, Celine said, and there was no fear in it, only steady, determined resolve. But we will face it together, 5 enclaves strong instead of 1, and I find, standing here tonight, that I believe that will be enough. She looked up at him, something warm and unguarded in her expression beneath the ancient amphitheater's mingled moonlight and firelight. Whatever comes next, Guardian, I am glad, more than I know how to properly express, that you fell out of that impossible sky and chose to stay. Me too, Issei said quietly, and together they turned to join the rest of the alliance, settling in for what little rest the coming days would allow. 5 enclaves worth of hard-won hopes standing steady beneath 3 watchful moons, ready, at last, to face whatever this broken world's oldest, most patient hunters decided to send against it next. Later, long after most of the amphitheater had settled into quiet, exhausted rest, Issei found himself unable to sleep, the enormity of the last month pressing too insistently against his thoughts to allow for easy stillness. He climbed to the highest tier of the ancient seating instead, looking out over the scattered fires and sleeping delegations below, and found Lucien already there, seated alone, gazing out at the same quiet scene with an expression Issei hadn't seen on the old steward's face before, something almost peaceful beneath the ever-present weight of responsibility. "Trouble sleeping, guardian?" Lucien asked, without turning. "Too much to think about," Issei admitted, settling onto the weathered stone beside him. "A month ago I woke up in a room I didn't recognize, on a world I'd never heard of, and now there are 5 enclaves out there planning to fight back against 300 years of being hunted. It's a lot to sit with." "It is," Lucien agreed. "I confess, some nights, I still find myself waiting to wake from it, half convinced this entire month has been some particularly vivid dream my exhausted mind conjured to make the grinding weight of decline more bearable." He glanced over, something searching in his weathered gaze. "Do you understand yet, truly, what you have done here? Not simply for the Obsidian Court, though that alone would have been more than any steward before me managed to secure. For every enclave now watching, deciding, hoping again for the first time in longer than most of their people can remember. I'm starting to," Issei said honestly. "It's bigger than I expected, when I told you I'd help, that first morning. I didn't think it all the way through to this. 5 enclaves. A council. An actual chance at changing something that's been broken for 300 years. Few of us ever think that far ahead, when we first commit to doing what feels right in the moment it is asked of us," Lucien said. "I did not, when I chose to bring you into that war room instead of locking you away to be studied first. I simply understood, watching you wake in that chamber, confused and uncertain but entirely unafraid of what I might ask of you, that this enclave could not afford to waste whatever chance you represented on excessive caution." A faint, tired smile touched his scarred face. "I am glad, every day since, that instinct proved correct." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the scattered fires below slowly burn down toward embers, the 3 moons continuing their slow, familiar arc across the bruised and starless sky. "Get some rest, guardian," Lucien said finally, rising with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who had carried considerable weight for considerable time. "Tomorrow we begin the harder work of turning tonight's hope into something that survives contact with whatever choir command decides, once their observation period finally runs its course. You will need whatever strength you can gather for what comes after." "I know," Issei said, watching the old steward make his way back down toward the sleeping camp below. "I'm ready for it." "I believe you are," Lucien said, pausing at the edge of the tier to look back at him one final time. "That, more than anything else you have shown us these past weeks, is precisely why this alliance stands even the smallest chance of succeeding where 300 years of careful survival never could." He continued on, leaving Issei alone atop the ancient amphitheater's highest tier, and Issei sat there a while longer, watching the moons complete their patient arc, feeling Drake's steady, familiar presence settle alongside his own quiet resolve, until exhaustion finally pulled him down toward whatever rest the night still had left to offer before the coming days demanded everything he had to give once more. Thanks for listening.